Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Rodrigo, and I'm telling this story because I need to get it off my chest. It's not a legend or a campfire tale. It's something I lived through with my family in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, and I still struggle to process it. It all began when my mother received a call from a notary in Albany. Her great uncle, Don Ephraim, had died without direct heirs and left her a property, a cabin in the Adirondacks. My mother barely remembered him, but the idea of a cabin in the mountains excited us. When we arrived, we found a construction of wood and stone nestled among pines and maples. The cabin was in good condition, though it showed signs of abandonment. We decided to spend the weekend there to explore and decide what to do with the property. The first night, while we were unpacking, I noticed that the living room floor creaked strangely in one corner. The next day, I moved a heavy piece of furniture and discovered a hidden trapdoor under an old rug. With effort, I opened it and found a wooden staircase that descended to a basement. The basement was full of dust and cobwebs. In one corner was a table with several stacked documents. They were letters, maps, and records dating from the mid-20th century. Some were typewritten, others handwritten. What I read left me frozen. The papers talked about clandestine meetings, movement of people, and activities that had nothing to do with recreation. There were mentions of transfers, interrogations, and temporary storage. One of the documents, dated 1974, mentioned Operation Fog, with detailed instructions on how to maintain discretion and what to do in case of an inspection. There were also black and white photographs of uniformed men, vehicles without plates, and people with blindfolded eyes. I recognized some places in the Adirondacks in the images. Everything pointed to the cabin having been used by some governmental or paramilitary entity for covert activities. That night I shared the findings with my family. My mother was dismayed, my father skeptical. We decided not to touch anything else and returned to Albany the next day. Before leaving, I took photos of the documents and saved them in a folder on my computer. Back home, I researched more about Operation Fog and found vague references in declassified files. It seemed to have been a counterinsurgency operation during the 70s, during the height of domestic surveillance programs in the United States. The cabin, apparently, had been one of the operation centers. Since then, I've had the feeling that someone is watching us. Once, reviewing the photos I took, I noticed a figure in the background of one of them, among the trees. It wasn't there when I took the photo. I tried to report what I found, but local authorities showed no interest. I even received an anonymous call warning me to stop investigating. We decided to sell the cabin, but every attempt was frustrated by legal problems or buyers who backed out without explanation. It's as if the property doesn't want to be sold, as if the past clings to it. Today the cabin is still there, empty in the middle of the mountains. Sometimes I think about going back and burning everything, but something stops me. Maybe it's fear, or maybe respect for the stories it keeps between its walls. What I know is that there are places that, although they seem idyllic, hide secrets that are better not to unearth. This is my story. I'm not seeking fame or attention, just sharing what I lived through and warning that sometimes what we inherit isn't always a blessing. A few months passed, and life continued, at least in appearance. I could no longer sleep well. I dreamed of the cabin, of that figure among the trees, of muffled voices behind the walls. My girlfriend at the time, Mariana, told me it was stress to let it go, but I couldn't. There was something unresolved up there, something that wouldn't leave me in peace. One early morning, I woke up with a clear thought, as if someone had whispered it in my ear. Check it again. Not everything is in plain sight. I got up, took the car keys, and headed for the Adirondacks. I arrived when it was barely getting light. The air in the mountains smelled of humidity and pine resin, but there was also something sour, metallic, that turned my stomach. I entered the cabin and went straight to the basement. I had left it as it was, with the documents still on the table. I started checking the walls, touching the panels, looking for holes, lines, anything. In a corner at the back, behind some boxes, I found something I hadn't seen before, a vertical crack, barely visible in the wood. I pulled a little and felt it give way. I pushed harder until a hidden door opened. Behind it was a narrow corridor, barely 5 feet high, made with poorly placed cement blocks. It led to a windowless room, barely illuminated by a hanging, rusted bulb that still worked. In there was a metal bed, rusted, a desk with a couple of notebooks, and handcuffs anchored to the wall. I froze. That room wasn't just any basement, it was a cell. I took one of the notebooks. It had a worn cover, covered with mold, but inside were notes written in blue ink with clear, firm handwriting. They were like diaries written by someone named Z. Martinez. He talked about entire days locked up, about interrogations, about noises upstairs, about screams. He mentioned numbers, names, places. I didn't understand everything, but there was a phrase that repeated several times. He who listens doesn't forget. On the last page, the ink was smeared as if it had been written with tears. They don't kill me because I'm useful. When I stop being so, they'll know about me. I felt the air become denser. It was as if that phrase had activated something. I left the cabin without looking back and drove back to Albany. When I arrived, I connected the laptop and started transcribing the diary. I thought about taking it to some journalist who investigates these things, but before deciding, they called me. It was an unknown number. When I answered, I heard nothing for a few seconds. Then a dry, clear male voice said, "Rodrigo, we know you were there. We know what you read." I was paralyzed. "Don't continue with this," he continued. "Don't publish anything, for your own good and that of yours." They hung up. Weeks passed where I doubted. I deleted files, saved them again, shared them with close friends in case something happened to me. But I still had that impulse to know more. So I went back one last time. I only brought a camera, a powerful flashlight, gloves, and food. My plan was to record everything, leave a record. I wanted to understand who Z. Martinez was, why they had locked him up there. I checked the cell again meticulously, and noticed that on the ceiling, almost imperceptible, there was a newer wooden board. I removed it and found a package wrapped in plastic. Inside were photos, dozens. Some of covered bodies, others of meetings with men in suits. Even one where you could clearly see an official shield of the U.S. Army. And there, among all of them, an image that changed me forever. It was my grandfather, young, in a military uniform, standing in front of the same cabin, smiling. I returned home in a state of shock. I didn't tell my mother anything, but I found an old letter in one of her boxes addressed to her, signed by Ephraim. It said, "Never ask about what we did there. If you inherit it, leave everything as it is. Some silences protect more than any word." Since then, I haven't returned. I kept the photos, the diaries, everything. Sometimes I think about publishing it, but every time I try, something stops me. An inner voice, or maybe a real threat. I don't know if it was my grandfather who ordered those horrors, or if he was just another cog. What I do know is that that cabin wasn't a refuge. It was a clandestine detention center, and the silence surrounding its history is as thick as the forests that hide it. Last month, someone broke into my apartment. They didn't take anything valuable, just the computer where I had copies of the documents. They left the door locked from inside. On the table, an envelope with a single sheet. He who listens doesn't forget, but sometimes he who stays quiet survives. Since then, I sleep with the light on, and I still wonder how much of my inheritance is blood disguised as forest. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Ivan, and I've been a mountain biker for over 10 years. I've ridden trails in Oregon, Colorado, and even in the mountains of Washington, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the Cascade Range. I've never told this story out loud, but I feel I need to, not to scare, but to warn. It was a Saturday in November with clear skies and crisp air. I decided to train alone in the Cascades, specifically in the area near Mount Hood where the trails are challenging and the scenery is spectacular. I knew the routes well, especially the circuit that goes from Timberline Lodge to Mirror Lake. But that day I wanted to explore a bit further. I had my bike, a backpack with water, energy bars, my cell phone with GPS, and a physical map just in case. I left early, around 7 in the morning, and started pedaling along the familiar trails. The terrain was dry, and the scent of pine filled the air. After about 2 hours of riding, I reached a fork that I didn't remember seeing before. It wasn't on my map or GPS. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take that path. The trail was narrow, with dense vegetation and no signs of recent use. As I advanced, the silence became deeper. Only the crunch of leaves under my wheels and the distant song of some birds could be heard. After about 20 minutes, the trail opened into a clearing where, to my surprise, stood a wooden cabin. The cabin was small, single-story, with weathered wooden walls and a gabled roof covered with broken shingles. The windows were boarded up, and the door, though old, seemed recently repaired. The strangest thing was that there were no visible roads leading to it, no signs of life around it. I got off my bike and approached cautiously. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. I tried to peek through a crack between the boards on the window, but the interior was in shadows. I decided not to enter and returned to my bike to continue on my way. When I retraced my steps, I noticed that the trail I had taken seemed different. The vegetation was denser and the path less defined. I activated my phone's GPS, but couldn't get a signal. I began to feel disoriented. After pedaling aimlessly for almost an hour, I found a stream that I didn't remember crossing before. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to a familiar path. Finally, after another hour of effort, I reached an area I recognized and was able to return to the main route, back home. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I searched maps and cyclist forums, but found no reference to construction in that area. I consulted with some friends who know the Cascades well, and none knew of its existence. One day while browsing the internet, I found an article that talked about an abandoned cabin in the Cascades, built over 40 years ago by a family that mysteriously disappeared. It was said that the cabin was in a forested area and had been the scene of strange phenomena. I can't be sure it's the same one, but the coincidences are unsettling. Since that day, I've returned to the Cascades, but never alone and always on known routes. The experience taught me not to underestimate the mountain and to respect its mysteries. I don't know what exactly I found, but I know there are places that for some reason prefer to remain hidden. If you decide to explore the Cascades, do it with caution and remember that sometimes curiosity can lead us to discover things we weren't prepared to face. Weeks passed since that day. Routine returned, training continued, and the cabin became a blurry memory, almost like a bad dream. Something had been planted in me, a kind of itch in my soul. I couldn't let it go. Not knowing bothered me more than any fear I might have. I convinced myself that maybe there was a logical explanation, some forgotten rural construction used by shepherds or hunters. So I went back one Sunday in mid-December. I brought my friend Arthur. I told him about the place, the route, and convinced him to come with me. He's as stubborn as I am. We went back the same route with GPS and even a drone he had to document. But no matter how much we followed my steps, the fork's path was no longer there. We walked through the undergrowth looking for some indication, but found nothing. Not the clearing, not the cabin, nothing. "Are you sure it was here?" Arthur asked me, panting. "Of course, right here. This tree with the bark split by lightning, I remember it perfectly." He looked at the GPS. Nothing. As if the place had never existed. We started doubting our memory. We returned without saying much. That night, reviewing the data from my training app from the first time, I noticed something weird. The stretch where I found the cabin was like unrecorded, a void, as if I had stopped the route or as if the clock had stopped working. It chilled my blood. A few days later, I received a message on Instagram from a user with no profile picture or posts. It said, "I know you found the cabin. Don't go back. You don't know what you saw." I didn't reply. I blocked the guy and tried to act like nothing happened, but it was too late to ignore it. Weeks passed, and one night very early, around 4:30 in the morning, someone knocked on my door. I live in an apartment building in Portland. It's rare for someone to knock so early. I looked through the peephole, no one. I went to the window on the second floor, then I saw it. There was a bike leaning against the tree in front of my building. My bike. The same one I had gone to the Cascades with. But it was inside my apartment. I ran downstairs. When I came out, there was no bike, no one. In my desperation, I started looking for old Cascade files, maps from the 60s and 70s. In a collection at Portland State University Library, I found a collection of topographic surveys with aerial photos in black and white. There it was. In a shot from 1972, you could see the clearing and a small building in the middle of the forest. By 1975, in another photo, it was no longer there. I kept investigating. I found an article from 1973 in a low-circulation newspaper. It talked about the disappearance of a surveyor who was mapping forest routes. According to the article, the man had last been seen near an old hunter's cabin that doesn't appear in records. The note was dismissed as a common disappearance, but it mentioned the surveyor's name, Eduardo Esparza. My mother has a family archive with genealogical trees and such things. One night, out of curiosity, I looked up the surname Esparza and found it. Eduardo Esparza was my grandfather's cousin. I never knew him. No one mentioned him. Supposedly, he had died in an accident in the Sierra Gorda, and if not, I went back to review the photos I took in the Cascades. There was one where I accidentally captured part of the cabin in the corner of the frame. I enlarged the image, and between the shadows you could see something scratched on the wall. It was a word, my name. Ivan, I tried to ignore it, I really tried. I stopped training for a while, but eventually I went back. One day at the beginning of the year, I went to Mount Tabor, another of my favorite places. I thought that by staying away from the Cascades I would feel better. I met up with a group of cyclists and decided to join them. We went deeper into the forest, chatting. One of them was looking at me strangely. I thought he recognized me from social media. "You're Ivan, right?" "Yes." "Someone left this for you at the park entrance this morning," he said, pulling a wrinkled envelope from his backpack. It was a folded paper, stained with dirt. I opened it. It just said, "See you soon. You know how to come back." And at the bottom of the paper was drawn the same clearing with the cabin. Since that day, I haven't gone back to train in the Cascades or any other mountain. I sold my bike, I moved, but it doesn't matter. Some nights when the wind runs strong, I hear among the trees a door slam shut forcefully, and I know the cabin is still there, waiting, and that I will eventually return. My name is Julian, and I'm a nature photographer. For years, I've traveled through mountains, forests, and deserts seeking to capture the ephemeral beauty of the natural world. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced on Mount Whitney. This story isn't a legend or an exaggeration. It's a real account of an experience that marked me deeply. It was mid-February, and I decided to undertake a solo expedition to Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the contiguous United States at 14,505 feet above sea level. My goal was to capture the sunrise from the summit, an image I had dreamed of for years. I arrived in Lone Pine, a small town in California, and from there hired a four-wheel drive transport that took me to Whitney Portal at 8,360 feet above sea level. I spent the afternoon acclimatizing and preparing my equipment: crampons, ice axe, camera, tripod, and enough food and water for the journey. At 11:30 p.m., I woke up, bundled up, and began the ascent. The night was clear, and the full moon illuminated the trail. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by the crunch of snow under my boots. As I ascended, I began to notice details that made me uncomfortable. At about 11,000 feet, I found fresh footprints in the snow that didn't match mine. They were larger and seemed recent. I thought maybe another climber had started the ascent before me, although I hadn't seen anyone at the portal. I continued my path, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Every so often I would stop and turn off my headlamp, waiting to hear some sound. Nothing, just the wind and my labored breathing. When I reached the infamous 99 switchbacks, a section of steep zigzags before the final approach, I noticed that some rocks had been moved recently. This wasn't common, since that area usually remains untouched due to the cold and difficulty of the terrain. The idea that someone else was nearby, without making themselves known, made me nervous. Around 4:30 a.m., I reached the beginning of the final approach to the summit. I put on my crampons and began the final traverse toward the peak. The ascent was exhausting, but the prospect of capturing the sunrise from the summit drove me to continue. At 6:15 a.m., I reached the summit. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, tinting the sky orange and pink. I set up my tripod and began taking photographs. The view was impressive: the Sierra Nevada range, clouds below my feet, and the shadow of the peak projecting into the valley. However, the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. I decided not to stay long and began the descent. As I descended the final approach, I noticed something that chilled my blood. My ascent footprints were accompanied by others that weren't there before. They were larger and deeper and followed exactly my trajectory. Someone had been following me, staying at a prudent distance. I quickened my pace, trying to stay calm. When I reached the switchbacks, I found a black scarf tied to a rock, something that wasn't there during the ascent. It wasn't mine, and it made no sense for someone to leave it in that place. Finally, I reached the portal around 10:30 a.m. I checked my belongings. Everything was in order. There were no signs of other people in the area. The driver picked me up at 11 a.m., and during the trip back to Lone Pine, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. To this day, I don't know who or what followed me that night on Mount Whitney. I found no concrete evidence, but the footprints and the scarf are sufficient proof for me. I've shared this story with colleagues and friends, and although some think it was my imagination or the effect of altitude, I know what I experienced. This experience taught me that even in the solitude of the mountain, we're never truly alone. Nature keeps secrets we may never fully understand. Back home, I reviewed the photographs from the expedition. The first ones were spectacular: the clear sky, the Whitney summit, the shadow of the mountain extending over the valley. But when I got to the last series of photos, just before sunrise, I noticed something strange. There was a blurry image, as if the shutter had activated by itself. It was taken when I was putting my camera in my backpack to begin the descent. In that photo, barely distinguishable in the lower left margin, appeared a dark silhouette further down on the final approach. There was no one else that day on the mountain. I confirmed it later with portal records and local guides. That figure had no reason to be there. I tried to convince myself it was a play of light, a shadow, a rock, but the more I observed, the clearer it became that it was a person, or at least something with human form. 3 weeks later, I decided to return to Lone Pine. I brought the printed photograph and asked guides with experience on Whitney. There was an older man, Don Rosendo, who agreed to look at the photo. He remained silent for a good while, as if processing something he didn't want to say. "Look, young man," he finally told me. "What you saw, others have felt it too, but not many come down to tell about it." He told me that for years some climbers talked about a presence on the upper slopes that never let itself be seen face to face, but sometimes left marks, moved stones, footprints in snow, pieces of clothing. A German climber disappeared in 1999, and they only found his camera with a last image very similar to mine. "And hasn't anyone gone up to search?" I asked. "Once," he said, "but those who went don't want to talk. One of them had something happen to his head. He's not the same since then." Months passed. I couldn't sleep. I dreamed of the summit, of that figure behind me. I became obsessed. I went back to training, improved my equipment, prepared to climb again. This time with everything recorded on video. I wanted answers. It wasn't morbid curiosity. It was about closing the cycle. I wanted to prove if someone really followed me that night. I went back up alone, this time in March when snow still covers the upper slopes, but the weather is more stable. I ascended with a GoPro on my helmet and another fixed on my chest. On the switchbacks, I found signs against stones marked with white chalk, as if someone wanted to leave a trail. There was no chalk in my equipment. On the final approach, I felt that presence again, but I didn't look back. I just advanced. At the summit at sunrise, I knelt and left the camera recording the landscape. It was identical to that other time, but the feeling was different. There was no wind, no noise, just a silence that weighed. Then I noticed something a few meters from the summit, a bulge. I approached, and what I saw left me frozen. It was an old sweater, frozen and half buried in the snow. Inside was a package wrapped in plastic. I opened it with trembling hands. It was a photographic camera, a Canon from the 90s. Someone had left it there, buried for years. I went down with that find, and days later, I managed to extract the memory card. It still worked. The photos were of landscapes identical to those I had taken. Then appeared nighttime images of the ascent, and at the end, a sinister image, a black silhouette standing on the summit, looking at the horizon. But the impossible thing was that in that image, you could also see another figure descending the final approach. It was me, with my black backpack and blue cap, captured in a photo that had been taken years before I had even set foot on Mount Whitney. I never returned to the mountain. I sold my cameras, left photography, not because I'm afraid, but because I understood something I can never explain. In that place, time isn't as we believe. Someone or something watches those who climb alone in silence in the darkness. It doesn't show itself, doesn't attack. It just observes, waits, and sometimes lets you see yourself from where you shouldn't have been. Since then, every time I close my eyes, I don't see my photos. I see his, and he's smiling. My name is Matthew, and for over a decade I've been a hiking guide in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I've walked every trail, every path between the oaks and pines, and I've shared the beauty of these mountains with hundreds of tourists. But there's one night that changed my life forever, one that left me with unanswered questions and a burden I still can't shake. It was mid-April 2023 when a group of 6 hikers, 3 couples from different parts of the East Coast, signed up for a night hike I organized from Shenandoah Valley to Raven's Rock Overlook. This trail, known for its breathtaking views and tranquility, was one I knew well. The plan was to start at sunset, camp near the overlook, and return at dawn. We met at the visitor center where I checked their gear and made sure everyone was prepared for the hike. The group was enthusiastic, and after a brief safety talk, we began our ascent. Night fell quickly, and the full moon illuminated our path. The forest was silent, interrupted only by the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional call of an owl. We reached the overlook without incident. We pitched our tents and shared stories around a small campfire. At dawn, I woke up and noticed the tents were empty. I thought the group had gone to explore the overlook on their own, but when I searched for them, I found no trace. Their backpacks, flashlights, and belongings were there, but they weren't. I called their names, searched the surroundings, but there was no response. I decided to return to the valley to get help. I reported to local authorities, and a search was organized with volunteers and rescue teams. For days, we combed the area without finding clues. State police and the National Guard joined the search. Security cameras in the valley were reviewed, and locals were interviewed, but no one had seen the group after our departure. Authorities began to suspect me, but my record and lack of evidence against me kept me free. The families of the missing arrived desperate for answers. We shared the pain and uncertainty, but there was nothing I could offer them. A month later, I decided to return to the overlook alone, hoping to find something we had overlooked. As I walked the trail, I noticed marks on the trees that weren't there before, symbols carved recently. When I reached the overlook, I found a scarf that belonged to one of the hikers hanging from a branch, fluttering in the wind. I picked it up and felt a mixture of hope and fear. Had they been there after all? What had happened to them? 2 years have passed since that night, and there are still no answers. I continue guiding groups through the Blue Ridge Mountains, but I no longer offer night hikes. Every time I pass Raven's Rock Overlook, I leave a stone in memory of the 6 missing hikers, hoping that someday the truth will be revealed. This experience taught me that even in the most familiar and safe places, the unexpected can happen, and that the forest, with all its beauty, keeps secrets we may never understand. I returned to the place a couple more times, each time with more caution. I no longer carried just my backpack and flashlight. I also brought an old recorder that a journalist friend from Richmond had lent me. I wanted to capture sounds, anything that might give me a clue. I don't know if I was doing it for the hikers or for myself, because since that night, something in me had changed. One early morning, while recording sounds near the spot where I had found the scarf, I heard something. It was barely a whisper. I played it back several times when I got home, and I would swear it said a name, Veronica, one of the names from the group. I was frozen. I thought about calling the authorities again, but they no longer took me seriously. They believed I had lost my mind. Months passed. Occasionally, someone curious would ask about the case, but the story had gone cold. Until September of the following year, when a crew of forest workers reforesting the area near the overlook reported something strange. They sought me out because they knew of my connection to the case. I accompanied the workers to a closed section of the forest, about 2 miles from the overlook. There, among the trees, was a structure of perfectly stacked stones, like some kind of altar or shelter. There were no obvious signs of recent life, but when we dismantled the pile of stones, we found something, a phone. The device was turned off, covered by a plastic bag, but surprisingly intact. We took it to town, and a technician managed to turn it on. It was one of the hiker's cell phones, Carla's. I recognized it by the purple case with a sugar skull that she had proudly shown that night. In the phone's gallery was only one new image, a video. They had recorded it that same night, just minutes before they disappeared. The group is gathered around the campfire. You can see them laughing, relaxed. Carla is recording, and at one point the camera turns toward the forest. In the background, you can see a figure among the trees. It's blurry, but definitely a person. The camera shakes, nervous laughter is heard. One of the men, possibly Mario, says jokingly, "Who's that?" The camera cuts off abruptly. That was the last file. Not a single second of recording after that. I reviewed the recording over and over. The figure doesn't move, just stands there, as if watching them. We couldn't identify it, and none of the families recognized anyone. But an old man from the valley, Don Fidel, who had been a guide many years ago, asked to see the video. When he saw it, he remained silent for long minutes. Then he told me something I had never heard before. He said that decades ago, a man named Benjamin had disappeared in that same area. He was with a group of forestry workers and never returned. Stories said he had decided to stay and live alone in the forest, that he couldn't stand civilization. Some said he went mad and still wandered the hills, avoiding being seen. Don Fidel looked at me intently and said, "That silhouette looks like Benjamin." Same way of standing, the drooped shoulders, the face hidden by the hat. We never found the 6 hikers. We never knew who or what that figure was. But there's something I haven't told anyone until now. 2 weeks after that discovery, while I was sleeping at home, I heard a knock on my window. I live alone on the outskirts of town where the mountain begins to rise. I got up afraid. I didn't turn on the light. I opened the curtain. On the window, pinned with a rusty knife, was another scarf. It was identical to the first one, same brand, same texture. Only this one had dark stains, almost black, dried. I didn't touch it. I closed the window, and the next day I left for Richmond. I haven't returned to the valley since then. Sometimes when I go to sleep, I hear something. Not voices, not noises. It's a feeling, as if someone from the forest is still watching me. As if 6 people are still out there, trapped in a place we don't understand. And as if someone or something is making sure no one else ever finds them again. That's why I'm telling this, because I don't want anyone else to disappear. Because the mountains, as beautiful as they are, keep things that aren't on maps or tourist brochures. And because, although I'll never know for certain, I believe that night something or someone decided that not all of us were going to return. My name is Jose, and I'm from Guatemala. Several years ago, I made the treacherous journey to cross the Rio Grande into Texas, driven by desperation and hope for a better future for my family. What happened to me during that crossing still gives me nightmares, and I've never told the full story to anyone until now. Back home, my small auto repair shop was failing. The local gangs demanded protection money that I simply couldn't afford, and with a wife and young son to support, I saw no choice but to attempt the dangerous border crossing that so many of my neighbors had made before me. My plan was to reach my cousin in Houston, who had successfully made the crossing 3 years earlier and was now working construction. I traveled north with my childhood friend Carlos, and we spent 5 days in Reynosa waiting for the right conditions to cross the river. The Rio Grande had been running high and fast due to heavy rains upstream, and several people had already drowned attempting the crossing that week. We couldn't afford to wait much longer. Our money was running out, and every day we stayed increased the risk of being caught by Mexican authorities. Finally, on a Tuesday night in late September, the water level dropped enough that our coyote gave us the green light. We would cross at 2:30 in the morning when Border Patrol shifts changed, and there was a brief window of reduced surveillance. There were 4 of us making the crossing: Carlos, myself, and 2 brothers from Honduras, whose names I never learned. The night was moonless and eerily quiet as we approached the riverbank. The water looked black and forbidding, moving much faster than it had appeared from a distance. I'm a decent swimmer. I grew up near Lake Atitlan, but this was different. The Rio Grande is unpredictable, full of hidden currents and debris that can trap you underwater. We entered the water slowly, trying not to create any splashing sounds that might alert the Border Patrol agents we knew were patrolling nearby. The current was stronger than expected, and within minutes, we were being swept downstream faster than we could swim across. My heart was pounding as I fought to keep my head above water, while also trying to move toward the American side. We were about halfway across when it happened. I felt something grab my ankle, not something, someone. A hand. Fingers wrapped around my leg with a grip that was surprisingly strong, and whatever it was began pulling me downward. At first, I thought one of my companions had gotten into trouble and was grabbing onto me for support. But when I looked around, all three of them were several yards away from me. The hand, and I swear it was a human hand, held onto my ankle with increasing pressure. I could feel individual fingers, the texture of waterlogged skin, even what felt like fingernails digging into my flesh. I was wearing shorts, so there was nothing between this thing and my bare skin. The grip was cold, much colder than the water around me, and it had an almost desperate quality to it. I tried to kick free, but the hand wouldn't let go. Panic set in as I realized I was being pulled under. I started thrashing in the water, trying to stay afloat, while also attempting to break free from whatever had grabbed me. Despite my fear of alerting the authorities, I had to call out to my companions for help. "Something's got me," I shouted as quietly as I could manage. "Help me." Carlos immediately swam toward me, followed by the two brothers. They grabbed my arms and began pulling me toward the shore, but the entire time, I could still feel that hand gripping my ankle. It was the strangest sensation, being pulled in two directions at once, as if I was caught in some kind of supernatural tug-of-war. The hand held on until we were almost at the riverbank. Then, suddenly, the pressure released, and I felt whatever had been holding me let go. I practically threw myself onto the muddy shore, gasping and shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't stop telling my companions that something in the water had grabbed me, that there was someone else in the river who needed help. Two of the men waded back into the shallow water near the shore to search for whoever I thought had grabbed me. They were only in water up to their waists when one of them called out that he had found something. Together, they began dragging what looked like a bundle of clothing toward the bank. As they pulled it closer, the awful truth became clear. It was a body, a man, probably in his 30s, who had been in the water for what must have been weeks. He was in an advanced state of decomposition, bloated and discolored from his time in the river. His clothes were torn and waterlogged, and his skin had taken on a grayish, mottled appearance that made him barely recognizable as human. But here's what still haunts me. This man, who was clearly dead, had somehow reached out and grabbed my ankle while I was swimming. How is that possible? How does a corpse, waterlogged and decomposing, have the strength or the ability to grasp onto a living person with such determination? Maybe he was trying to tell us something, or maybe he just didn't want to be alone in that dark water anymore. Maybe he wanted to be found, to be pulled from the river that had become his tomb. I'll never know for sure, but the experience left me deeply shaken. We couldn't stay to do anything more for the poor man. We had to keep moving before dawn, when the border patrol would resume their regular patrols. We left him on the riverbank, hoping that authorities would find him, and that his family would eventually learn what happened to him. But I walked away from that river a changed man. The crossing had been successful. We made it to the other side and eventually reached Houston. But the memory of that cold, desperate hand gripping my ankle, of that man who had died trying to make the same journey I was making, never left me. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling phantom fingers wrapped around my leg, pulling me down into dark water. I often wonder who he was, what drove him to risk everything for a chance at a new life. He was someone's son, maybe someone's father or brother. Someone somewhere is probably still waiting for him to call, still hoping to hear that he made it safely across. Instead, he became another casualty of the river that has claimed so many lives. That night taught me that the Rio Grande isn't just a body of water. It's a graveyard, filled with the dreams and hopes of people who never made it to the other side. And sometimes, those dreams reach out from the depths, desperate not to be forgotten. My name is Marcus, and 3 years ago I made the biggest decision of my life. I moved to Italy. While it turned out to be the best choice I ever made, that first year was absolutely terrifying. Let me give you some background. My great-grandfather had been an Italian immigrant who came to America in the 1920s. My grandfather, his only son, spent years gathering all the necessary paperwork so that he, my father, my siblings, and I could obtain dual citizenship. As a kid, this information meant nothing to me, but when I turned 18, my parents had saved enough money to take our entire family, including my aging grandfather, on a trip to Italy. It was incredible. I saw a joy and energy in my grandfather that I'd never witnessed before. I fell in love with Italy immediately and became obsessed with the idea of living there someday. I started learning Italian on my own and practiced with my grandfather almost every day until he passed away 2 years later. Everyone assumed my desire to emigrate would fade with time, even though they could see that after several years, my Italian had become quite fluent. So it was somewhat amusing when they were shocked that, right after graduating college, I took my savings and started researching rental prices and job opportunities in Italy. Having citizenship made everything much easier, though my complete lack of work experience and my brilliant degree in art history significantly limited my options. However, I quickly noticed that in rural areas, finding cheap rentals and work was much simpler. It wasn't ideal while I was getting established, but I finally booked my flight to Italy. I arrived in Rome, then took a bus that brought me to the place where I would live, a tiny Tuscan village called Montecroce. There I met my new landlord, a pleasant man in his 40s. He drove me to the house, located on the southern edge of the village. It was small but cozy, with an obviously ancient atmosphere. It had a single bedroom, a bathroom that opened into the living room, a small kitchen, and a dining area. I liked it immediately. Plus, it had internet, running water, and all the services I needed. This was my new home. The man didn't give me any warnings or make any comments about anything else. He handed me the keys and said he'd return on the second day of the following month to collect rent. I spent time unpacking and getting comfortable in my new house. It wasn't even 9 o'clock when I had already fallen asleep. A few days later, I started working in Montecroce's industrial zone at a factory where marble and granite slabs were cut. It was a noisy place and the work was exhausting, but I was happy. I felt like everything I was doing had a purpose. I had no idea that many strange things were about to begin. One night I came home from work. It was 8 o'clock and I urgently needed a shower. I rushed into the house and jumped into the shower to wash off all the stone dust that remained from cutting the slabs. I dried off, and when I came out into the living room covered only by a towel, I saw a dark silhouette standing in the dining room. An elderly woman turned around and looked back at me with a toothless smile. I froze and didn't say anything until she asked me in perfect Italian, "Where is Marco?" I searched my memory, but no, the landlord wasn't named Marco as far as I knew. Maybe it was his middle name. I assumed it was. I told her that he was now renting to me, and she remained still and asked, "When does Marco return?" I answered that he would return the following month. She immediately turned her back and walked out the door without giving me a chance to ask her anything. I ran to my room to put on a shirt and pants, but when I went out the front door, I no longer saw her. There were only the shadowy streets of Montecros, quite empty at that hour. I thought about calling the landlord to tell him what had happened. Maybe she was his grandmother, who didn't know he was now renting the place, or a neighbor, but I downplayed the matter. I assumed it was my mistake because I had entered hurriedly and hadn't locked the door. Besides, I didn't want to bother him with something so minor, so I forgot about it. The next morning I called my family and left my house to go to work. I was on my way to the main street to catch the bus when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. In a nearby alley was the lady from the previous night, wearing a black veil and a dark dress, similar to those from the night before. I felt very sorry for her. Maybe she was homeless. I waved at her and she waved back, even said something to me, but I didn't hear her and kept walking. When I returned home that night, I looked toward the same alley to see if she was there, but I only saw darkness. I thought she went home and I entered mine. I did my routine, showered, prepared my lunch for the next day, and sat down to watch videos on social media. Around 11 o'clock, I started to fall asleep, and when I had already closed my eyes, the sound of the doorbell made me wake up. I got up as quickly as I could and looked out, but there was no one on the street. I waited a few seconds behind the door, but they didn't ring again. I went back to sleep, and around 3 in the morning the doorbell rang again. I got up running, thinking it could be some emergency, opened the door abruptly, and again there was no one at the door, although I did see someone. About 20 meters down the street was the old lady with the veil and black dress. I asked her in the calmest tone possible if it had been her, or if she saw who had rung the doorbell, but she just shook her head and went into an alley. Up to that point, I hadn't made friends with any of the neighbors. Most were elderly people with kind faces, but you could tell that none of them wanted to be bothered, much less by the doubts of a strange young man who had moved in just a few days earlier. I had no one to ask about the old woman, but this was starting to make me uncomfortable. This episode repeated for several weeks at different hours. Sometimes I managed to see her hiding, and I soon realized that, for being 80 or 90 years old, she was very agile. One night I even stayed guard by the door, waiting for the doorbell to ring, and it rang. I opened the door immediately, no one. Just her, looking at me from a distance, poorly hidden behind a fence that faced the community garden. That was the last straw. The next night when I returned from work, I walked slowly down the street, hoping to see her in the alleys, but nothing could be distinguished. However, I must have looked quite strange, and a neighbor told me so. She asked me what I was doing. She was a relatively young woman, so I joked saying I'm looking for ghosts. I thought she would laugh with me, but she just gave me a kind smile and got up from her seat on her porch to whisper to me, "Be careful what you look for. This town is very old, and there's more than one spirit wandering around here." I asked her if she happened to be one, and she burst out laughing. That's how I met Francesca, the bakery manager and my first friend in Italy. I stayed chatting with her for a while, talking about various things like work and where we lived. But before we left, she asked me seriously, what was I supposed to be doing walking so slowly, looking everywhere? I told her I was looking for a chubby, short grandmother with a black veil. I hadn't finished speaking when I saw her expression change. I asked her what's wrong, and she simply answered, "Paulina has chosen you." I asked her what she meant, and although she was going to answer, she suddenly saw the darkness of the street and changed the subject. She told me that on Saturday she would explain, that I should stop by the bakery, and she would tell me about Paulina. Now I understand she was just trying to save me a night of bad sleep. It didn't work, but I appreciate that she tried. At night I entered my house, repeated my routine, happy to have finally met someone from the town, and locked myself in my room to entertain myself for a while when, again, the doorbell made me get up. As usual, there was no one at the door. It wasn't anything new, so I returned to my room, but I noticed that the window was open. I hadn't left it like that. I closed it immediately and became very anxious. I checked under the bed, in the closet, and in the bathroom, but found no one. I was nervous, and it wasn't easy for me to fall asleep, but I finally managed it. I estimate I rested for about 2 hours, although it only seemed like an instant. Suddenly I woke up in the middle of the darkness, petrified with fear as I saw Grandma Paulina asking me, in a much less friendly tone than the day before, "Where is Marco?" I was horrified. What was this woman doing in my room? And out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that the window was closed. How had she gotten in? I began to panic as she got closer to me and repeated, "Where is Marco?" And suddenly I woke up to the sound of the doorbell, which made me jump out of bed in the middle of the darkness. I ran to the switch and looked around me. There was no one. I checked the window again, but the lock was on and the street behind my house was empty. To say I was scared is an understatement, and I didn't want to go to the door, but the doorbell rang again, and I dared to go to the entrance. I opened slowly, and again the cold, empty streets of Montecros greeted me. I saw no one. I walked out of the house and saw her, looking back at me from an alley down the street, hidden behind a wall. I got brave, went down the street, and followed her through the alley with my house key in my hand, but when I turned the corner, she wasn't there. I ran to the end of the alley and saw her again, face to face, with her toothless smile and her grandmother appearance, but with a malevolent aura around her, as if I shouldn't be there, following her. I blinked, and in that instant she disappeared. I ran back to my house, locked the door and all the windows. By that time I still thought that some of this was natural. Well, actually I was in panic. I lay down on my bed with the light on and waited for dawn. Fortunately, the next day was Friday. We worked until 4 in the afternoon and I returned home early. I took a quick shower and went out again. I didn't want to be there. I went to Francesca's bakery. I greeted her, and since there were hardly any customers, we sat down to have coffee. She asked me what was wrong, as she noticed my fatigue, and after asking her several times not to make fun of me, I told her everything that happened. Not only did she not make fun of me, but she remained serious at every moment, and when I finished, she said, "I'm sorry, I just didn't want to scare you. That's Paulina's ghost." By that point, I was willing to believe whatever she told me. After what I experienced the night before, there was no room to be skeptical. I asked her who Paulina was, and she told me her story. Paulina was a very sweet grandmother who lived in Montecros in the early 1800s. She was sweet and had a son she adored named Marco. He worked in iron foundries in the industrial zone, left early and returned late at night, until one day he never returned. Marco died in an accident at the foundry, and his mother was unable to bear the pain and died shortly after. Since then, Paulina's spirit has been wandering around the town, although she doesn't usually bother anyone. Sometimes she's seen wandering through the alleys, as if looking for someone. When I asked Francesca why she was bothering me then, she told me that maybe I resembled Marco, although that was just her hypothesis. In the end, I learned why Paulina bothered me and asked me where Marco was, but I couldn't get rid of her so easily until I moved to Florence a year later. I think this story is already quite long, but I have many terrifying anecdotes that happened to me that year. Encounters with Paulina continued throughout that winter. She would appear at different times, always asking the same question, always with that mixture of maternal concern and supernatural malevolence. Sometimes I would find her standing at the foot of my bed in the middle of the night. Other times, she would be waiting in the kitchen when I came home from work. Francesca taught me some old Italian protective rituals, burning sage, placing salt at the doorways, keeping iron objects nearby. They helped somewhat, but Paulina's presence remained constant, a reminder that in this ancient land, the past never truly dies. When I finally saved enough money to move to Florence, I felt both relief and an unexpected sadness. In her strange way, Paulina had become part of my Italian experience, a connection to the deep history of this place I had come to love despite its ghosts. I'm 68 now, and I've spent the last 43 years of my life building a home here in Texas. I came up from Guatemala back in 1981, searching for something better, not just for myself, but for my family back home who were counting on the money I'd send. The border wasn't what it is today. There were fewer cameras, fewer agents, and more stretches of empty desert where a determined person could slip through unnoticed. The journey north had been grueling. 3 weeks of walking through desert heat, sleeping under highway overpasses, and rationing water that tasted like rust from old containers. I'd faced down coyotes, both the four-legged kind and the human smugglers who demanded money I didn't have. I'd hidden in drainage ditches while Border Patrol helicopters swept overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like mechanical eyes. But nothing had prepared me for what happened on that stretch of Highway 35, just south of San Antonio. Been walking along the shoulder for hours, my boots worn thin and my backpack feeling heavier with each step. The Texas heat was brutal even at night, and sweat stung my eyes as I trudged northward. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant rumble of an 18-wheeler, and I'd stick out my thumb hopefully, but truck after truck roared past without slowing. It must have been close to 2 in the morning when I finally heard the distinctive wheeze of air brakes behind me. I turned to see a massive Peterbilt pulling over, its running lights twinkling like Christmas decorations in the darkness. The cab door swung open, and I could hear norteño music drifting out into the night air. "Necesitas un aventón," the driver called down. His accent was familiar, Michoacan, maybe Jalisco. I nearly cried with relief. "Sí, por favor," I called back, jogging toward the truck. "Gracias, hermano." Climbed up into the cab, grateful for the air conditioning and the comfortable seat. The driver was about my age, maybe a little older, with calloused hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. A rosary hung from his rearview mirror, and there was a photo of a woman and 2 small children taped to his dashboard. "I'm heading to Dallas," he said, shifting into Spanish. "Where are you going?" "Anywhere north of here," I replied honestly. "I have a cousin in Houston who said he could help me find work." The driver nodded and put the truck in gear, but then something strange happened. Instead of pulling back onto the highway, he just sat there, engine idling, staring into his side mirror with a puzzled expression. "¿Qué pasa?" I asked after a minute or two. "The woman," he said quietly. "Is she with you?" I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm air blowing from the vents. "What woman?" He pointed toward his mirror. "The one walking behind us. I saw her following you when I first spotted you back there. She was maybe 50 yards behind, keeping to the shadows, but definitely following your path." I twisted around to look out the back window of the sleeper cab, but all I could see was empty highway stretching into the darkness. "I don't see anyone. I've been walking alone for days." The driver's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. No, I saw her clearly when my headlights swept the area. Tall woman in a white dress, walking with her head down. I figured she was your wife or sister or something. We both sat in uncomfortable silence for several long moments. Finally, he reached for the door handle. "We should check," he said. "I can't leave a woman stranded out here." Against my better judgment, I followed him down from the cab. The desert air hit us like a wall, still radiating heat from the day's sun. Our footsteps crunched on the gravel shoulder, as we walked back along the route I'd taken. The truck's headlights illuminated maybe 100 yards of empty asphalt and scrub brush. "Señora," the driver called out, "está usted bien?" Nothing, just the distant howl of a coyote and the whisper of wind through the mesquite. We walked back another 50 yards, calling out in both Spanish and English, but the highway was completely deserted. No footprints in the sandy soil beside the road, no movement in the brush, nothing to suggest another person had been there at all. The driver crossed himself and muttered a prayer under his breath. "I know what I saw," he whispered. "She was there, clear as day, walking with her arms at her sides, never looking up, just following your exact path." We hurried back to the truck without another word, both of us glancing nervously over our shoulders. As we climbed back into the cab, I noticed the driver's hands were shaking slightly as he shifted into drive. For the next 100 miles, neither of us spoke much. The radio played softly, a late-night talk show about UFO sightings and ghost stories, but we both seemed lost in our own thoughts. Every few minutes, I'd catch him checking his mirrors, and I found myself doing the same thing, searching the darkness behind us for any sign of movement. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of Austin that either of us brought up what had happened. As he pulled into a truck stop to refuel, the driver finally broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "my grandmother used to tell stories about spirits that attach themselves to travelers, lost souls looking for a way home." He paused to cross himself again. "She said they're drawn to people who are far from home, people who are carrying heavy burdens." I thought about his words as I watched him pump diesel into his massive fuel tanks. The fluorescent lights of the truck stop cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, making him look older than he probably was. When he was finished, he walked around to my side of the cab. "This is where we part ways, hermano," he said. "There's a Greyhound station 2 blocks that way. You can catch a bus to Houston from there." He pressed a $20 bill into my palm for the ticket. I tried to refuse the money, but he wouldn't hear of it. As I gathered my backpack and prepared to climb down, he grabbed my arm gently. "Be careful out there," he said. "And if you ever see her again, the woman in white, don't look back. Just keep walking forward." I never saw that trucker again, though I've often wondered what became of him. Did he make it safely to Dallas? Did he ever see that mysterious woman again on his late-night runs through the Texas desert? As for me, I kept his advice. In all the years since that night, whenever I've felt like someone was following me, I've never looked back. Some things are better left unseen, especially on those long, dark highways where the living and the dead sometimes cross paths in the middle of the night. But I still think about her sometimes, that woman in white who may or may not have been there. Was she a lost soul seeking passage to whatever comes next? A guardian spirit watching over travelers in need? Or just a trick of headlights and imagination on a lonely stretch of Texas highway? I suppose I'll never know for sure. But every time I drive past that section of Highway 35, I say a little prayer for her, just in case. My name is Daniel, and I'm 38 years old now. When I was 24, I made the dangerous journey north from Honduras, seeking a better life across the border. It wasn't my first attempt. I had tried twice before without success. But this third time, traveling through the unforgiving mountain ranges of southern Arizona, something happened that still haunts me to this day. I was part of a small group, 8 people in total, including 2 women and their young children. We had been walking for nearly 24 hours straight through the rocky terrain, our water running low and our energy nearly depleted. The desert mountains are deceptive. During the day, the heat is unbearable, But once the sun disappears behind those jagged peaks, the temperature drops dramatically, and darkness swallows everything whole. It was well past 10 o'clock at night when our guide decided we needed to rest. We found shelter among a cluster of mesquite bushes and prickly pear cacti, their thorny silhouettes creating an almost impenetrable wall around us. I couldn't relax, though. The desert at night is alive with dangers: rattlesnakes, scorpions, javelinas. Every rustle in the brush made my heart race, especially knowing we had children with us who were completely vulnerable. While the others tried to sleep, I kept watch alongside Miguel, an older man from El Salvador. We couldn't risk using flashlights. Border Patrol helicopters often swept these areas with powerful searchlights, and getting caught meant deportation or worse. So we sat in near-complete darkness, with only the pale moonlight filtering through the sparse desert vegetation to guide us. The silence was broken suddenly by the unmistakable sound of an infant crying. It was distant but clear, that desperate, heartbreaking wail that only a baby can make. Everyone in our group stirred immediately. The two mothers with us were especially alarmed, their maternal instincts kicking in as they imagined some poor child abandoned in this merciless wilderness. "We have to find that baby," whispered Rosa, one of the women. "It could die out here." Against our guide's protests, we decided to investigate. Moving carefully through the thorny underbrush, we followed the crying deeper into the desert. The sound seemed to echo off the rocky walls of a small canyon, making it difficult to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Rosa was practically running ahead of us, stumbling over rocks and getting scratched by thorns in her desperation to reach what she believed was a child in need. The crying grew louder as we climbed up a steep, rocky slope. My hands were bleeding from grabbing onto sharp stones for support, but we pressed on. Then, just as we reached what seemed to be the source of the sound, everything went silent. Dead silent. Even the usual desert night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of coyotes, had stopped. We spread out, searching frantically among the boulders and desert shrubs. Nothing. No baby, no sign that anyone had been there recently. That's when Miguel called out to us from behind a large boulder. "Over here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What we found made my blood run cold. Wedged between two weathered rocks was a small wooden cross, clearly handmade from desert branches bound together with what looked like pieces of torn cloth. Hanging from the cross was a small, faded teddy bear, its fur matted and discolored from months of exposure to the elements. It was a grave, a tiny grave. The women in our group began to weep. We all understood immediately what we had encountered. Someone, some family, had lost their child in this unforgiving place and had marked the spot where their little one's journey had ended. The crying we had heard wasn't from a living baby in distress, but from something far more heartbreaking. We stood there in that desolate place and said a prayer for the unknown child, asking that their spirit find peace and that they wouldn't be alone in that vast wilderness anymore. After that moment of reverence, we made our way back down the slope in complete silence. The rest of our journey continued without incident, but I carried that experience with me every step of the way. The image of that makeshift grave, that weathered teddy bear swaying in the desert wind, is something that will stay with me forever. It was a stark reminder of how many people have perished trying to cross these borders, and how many families have been torn apart by tragedy in their search for a better life. We never heard the crying again that night or any night after. But sometimes, when the wind picks up and whistles through the desert, I swear I can still hear that mournful sound echoing across the mountains. When I turned 35 last year, I made a resolution to explore more of America's hidden gems. Not the famous national parks or major cities that everyone visits, but the small towns and forgotten places that most people drive right past on their way to somewhere else. My 3 closest friends from college, Jake, Lisa, and Marcus, were equally enthusiastic about the idea. So we started planning weekend road trips to the most obscure destinations we could find. Our research led us to travel blogs and forums dedicated to America's strangest attractions. We'd already visited a museum of vintage lawn mowers in Kansas, a town in Nebraska where every building was painted bright purple, and a historical site in Montana where aliens supposedly landed in 1953. Each trip had been more bizarre and entertaining than the last. That's how we discovered Millbrook, population 217, tucked away in the hills of eastern Kentucky. The town had been featured on a paranormal investigation website, with multiple accounts of ghostly encounters dating back to the early 1900s. According to the stories, Millbrook had been built on land that was once a battlefield during the Civil War, and the restless spirits of soldiers still wandered the area at night. It sounded like exactly the kind of quirky destination we were looking for. The drive to Millbrook took nearly 7 hours from Louisville, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads as we got deeper into Appalachian coal country. The GPS on my phone lost signal twice, and we had to rely on an old paper map that Marcus had found in his grandfather's glove compartment. By the time we finally reached the town, the sun was setting behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the main street. Millbrook was even smaller than we'd expected. The entire downtown consisted of maybe a dozen buildings, a general store, a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, a combination post office and hardware store, and a few other structures that appeared to be abandoned. There was one traffic light, though it seemed unnecessary given that we hadn't seen another car for the last 20 miles. We'd planned to camp in the nearby state forest, but when we stopped at the general store to ask for directions, the elderly proprietor shook his head grimly. "Wouldn't recommend sleeping out there tonight," he said, glancing meaningfully toward the darkening hills. "Weather's supposed to turn bad around midnight. Flash flood warnings for the whole county." Sure enough, when we checked our phones, we found several severe weather alerts predicting heavy rainfall and possible flooding in low-lying areas. Our planned campsite was right next to a creek that would be dangerous if the water levels rose. "There's a motel about 2 miles up the road," the store owner continued. "The Pinewood Inn. Nothing fancy, but it's dry and safe." The Pinewood Inn turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from a motel built in 1968 and barely maintained since. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through the gaps. The neon sign flickered intermittently, and several of the room doors looked like they hadn't been painted in decades. But the elderly man at the front desk was friendly enough, and the rates were incredibly cheap. "We've got 4 rooms available," he told us, consulting a ledger that looked almost as old as the building. 7, 8, 9, and 10. They're all the same layout, so take your pick. My friends chose rooms 8, 9, and 10, which were adjacent to each other at the far end of the building. Room 7 was at the opposite end, separated from the others by the motel office and a small maintenance building. Normally, I would have preferred to be closer to my friends, but I was exhausted from the long drive and just wanted to get settled for the night. The room was exactly what I'd expected. 2 double beds with floral bedspreads that had seen better days, a small television bolted to a particle board dresser, a mini fridge that hummed loudly, and a bathroom with fixtures that were probably avocado green when they were new. But it was clean enough, and the bed seemed comfortable when I tested it. We'd planned to explore the town's allegedly haunted locations after dinner, but the combination of the long drive and the increasingly heavy rain changed our minds. Instead, we grabbed burgers at the local diner, listened to a few ghost stories from some friendly locals, and decided to call it an early night. I was back in my room by 9:30, settling in to read a book and listen to the rain drumming against the windows. The storm was really picking up intensity, with occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the parking lot and thunder rolling across the mountains. It was actually quite peaceful, the kind of white noise that usually helps me fall asleep quickly. But sleep didn't come easily that night. It started around 11 o'clock with what sounded like footsteps on the roof directly above my bed. At first, I assumed it was just the rain hitting the building at different angles, or maybe tree branches scraping against the gutters. Old buildings make all kinds of noises during storms, and I tried to ignore it, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be random weather noise. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Like someone was pacing back and forth in a measured pattern, wearing heavy boots on the roof above my room. I got up and peered out the window, expecting to see a maintenance worker or maybe a guest who'd had too much to drink. But the parking lot was empty except for our cars, and I couldn't see anyone on the roof from my angle. The pacing continued for another 10 minutes before gradually fading away. I was just starting to relax when a new sound began, a rhythmic scraping noise, like furniture being dragged across a wooden floor. It seemed to be coming from directly above me, in what should have been empty attic space. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Pause. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I grabbed my phone and texted my friends. Anyone else hearing weird noises? Jake responded immediately. What kind of noises? Sounds like someone walking around and moving furniture upstairs. There is no upstairs, Lisa texted back. It's a single-story building. That made me feel even more uneasy. I put on shoes and stepped outside to get a better look at the building's structure. Sure enough, the Pinewood Inn was clearly a single-story motel with a simple peaked roof. There was no second floor, no attic space large enough for a person to walk around in, and certainly no room for furniture to be dragged back and forth. When I went back inside, the sounds were louder than ever. Now it sounded like multiple people were up there, walking around and rearranging heavy objects. I could hear what seemed like chairs being pushed across the floor, maybe a table being moved from one spot to another. I tried calling the front desk, but there was no answer. The storm was getting worse, with wind howling around the building and rain lashing against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Maybe the desk clerk had gone home for the night, or maybe the phone lines were down. The noises above me continued until almost 2 in the morning, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers of movement, other times growing so loud that I was sure something heavy was about to crash through the ceiling onto my bed. I spent most of the night sitting in the room's single chair, staring up at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Around 2:15, everything went quiet. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the noise had been. I waited for nearly an hour, but the mysterious sounds didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my anxiety, and I managed to fall asleep in the chair. I woke up around 6:30 to weak morning sunlight filtering through the curtains and the sound of my friends talking in the parking lot. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fresh-washed smell and the drip of water from the roof gutters. "You look terrible," Marcus said when I joined them outside. "Rough night." I explained what I'd experienced, expecting them to tease me about my overactive imagination. Instead, they listened with increasingly serious expressions. "That's really weird," Jake said. "We didn't hear anything like that from our rooms. But we did notice something strange," Lisa added. "When we were coming back from dinner last night, the desk clerk made a weird comment about room 7. He said something like, 'Hope your friend doesn't mind the activity in that room.'" Activity. We asked him what he meant, but he just laughed it off and said old buildings make lots of noise during storms. I decided to ask the desk clerk directly about what I'd experienced. When I walked into the office, I found the same elderly man from the night before, reading a newspaper and sipping coffee from a mug that advertised a local bank. "How was your stay?" he asked pleasantly. "Interesting," I replied. "I heard some unusual sounds during the night. Footsteps and furniture being moved around upstairs." His expression didn't change, but I noticed his grip tighten slightly on his coffee mug. "Oh, that. Yeah, we get complaints about room 7 pretty regularly." "Complaints about what, exactly?" He sighed and set down his newspaper. "Look, son, I probably should have mentioned this when you checked in, but most folks don't take kindly to ghost stories. This place has been here for over 50 years, and room 7 has always been active." "Active how?" "Sounds mostly. Footsteps, furniture moving around, sometimes voices. It started back in '74, right after a guest died in that room. Heart attack, nothing suspicious, but ever since then, people report hearing noises at night." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why do you still rent out the room?" "Business is business," he shrugged. "Most guests don't experience anything, and those who do usually just chalk it up to the building settling or the weather. You're the first person in months to actually ask about it directly. Have you ever tried to, I don't know, investigate, get rid of whatever's causing it?" The old man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Son, I've owned this place for 32 years. I've had priests come in to bless it, psychics who claimed they could communicate with spirits, and paranormal investigators with all kinds of fancy equipment. Nothing's ever made a difference. So you just accept that one of your rooms is haunted. Accept that some things can't be explained," he said quietly. "And I've learned that fighting it only makes it worse. The sounds are harmless. They've never hurt anyone, never damaged property. It's just noise." I checked out a few minutes later, but before leaving town, I did some research at the local library. The librarian, a middle-aged woman who lived in Millbrook her entire life, was happy to help me dig through old newspaper archives. Sure enough, I found the story from 1974. A traveling salesman named Robert Harrison had died of a massive heart attack in room 7 of the Pinewood Inn. He was 43 years old, survived by a wife and 2 children in Ohio. According to the article, he'd been found by housekeeping the next morning, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. But there was more to the story. Robert Harrison had been a furniture salesman, specializing in office equipment and business furnishings. His car had been full of samples and catalogs when he died, and according to the police report, his room had been arranged like a showroom, with furniture samples positioned throughout the space to demonstrate different office layouts. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The sounds I'd been hearing, the footsteps, the scraping of furniture being moved around, matched exactly what a furniture salesman might do while setting up displays for potential customers. Was Robert Harrison still in room 7, decades after his death, continuing to arrange and rearrange his samples in an endless, futile attempt to make one last sale? I'll never know for sure. But I do know that I've never experienced anything like that night at the Pinewood Inn, and I hope I never do again. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that death might not be the end of our earthly responsibilities, that some part of us might be doomed to repeat the same tasks over and over for eternity. I still travel with my friends, and we still seek out America's strangest attractions. But these days, I'm a lot more careful about where I choose to spend the night. I need to tell this story anonymously because I'm still not completely legal in this country, and I can't risk drawing attention to myself. But what I witnessed during my crossing through the mountains of New Mexico is something that needs to be shared, even if some people won't believe it. This happened in late October, 3 years ago. I was traveling with 4 other men, all of us from different Central American countries, all desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at a new life. We had been walking through the mountain wilderness for 3 days, surviving on rationed water and energy bars, when one of our group started getting sick. His name was Eduardo, a quiet man from Nicaragua who was trying to reach his sister in Denver. On the 3rd night, he began complaining of severe dizziness and nausea. He couldn't keep any food down, and despite our limited water supply, he was becoming dangerously dehydrated. We were in the middle of nowhere, no roads, no cell phone service, no way to get help for him. The mountains at night are terrifying places. The temperature drops below freezing, and you're surrounded by the sounds of animals you can't see, coyotes howling in the distance, the rustle of unknown creatures moving through the brush. We had already encountered several rattlesnakes during our journey, and we knew that mountain lions and bears were common in the area. As we sat huddled together, trying to figure out what to do about Eduardo's condition, I noticed something unusual in the distance. Through the trees, maybe a mile away, I could see a faint orange glow. It looked like firelight, which seemed impossible in such a remote location. We were at least 20 miles from the nearest town, in terrain that was barely passable on foot. I pointed out the light to the others, and we all agreed that it might be our only chance to get help for Eduardo. We helped him to his feet and began making our way through the dense forest toward the source of the light. It took us nearly an hour of careful hiking through the darkness, trying not to make noise that might alert anyone to our presence. As we got closer, we could see that the light was coming from a small log cabin, almost hidden among the tall pine trees. Smoke was rising from a stone chimney, and there was indeed a fire burning in what appeared to be a fire pit outside the building. It was the most isolated dwelling I had ever seen. There was no road leading to it, no power lines, no indication of how anyone could possibly live there. We approached cautiously, staying hidden behind trees and rocks. We needed to see who lived there before revealing ourselves. It could be a border patrol outpost, or worse, criminals who might harm us. We crouched behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the cabin and waited to see if anyone would come outside. After about 15 minutes, the door opened and an elderly woman emerged. She was dressed entirely in black, a long dress that reached her ankles and a shawl that covered most of her gray hair. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about her appearance. She moved with purpose, carrying what looked like bundles wrapped in dark cloth. She began arranging these bundles around the fire pit in a specific pattern, creating what appeared to be some kind of circle. A few minutes later, an old man came out of the cabin. He was tall and gaunt, with long gray hair that hung past his shoulders. His clothes were stained with what looked like dried blood, and he carried a large wooden staff carved with symbols I didn't recognize. What happened next made my blood run cold. The woman unwrapped one of the bundles, revealing what was unmistakably part of a human torso. Without any hesitation, she threw it into the fire. The flames flared up immediately, and both the man and woman began chanting in a language I had never heard before. Eduardo, who had been barely conscious, suddenly grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "This is devil worship. They're practicing black magic." But we couldn't move. We were paralyzed by fear and fascination, unable to look away from the horrific scene unfolding before us. The couple continued their ritual, throwing more body parts into the fire while chanting and dancing around the flames. The smell of burning flesh began to drift toward our hiding spot, making us all feel sick. Then something even more disturbing happened. As the fire grew higher and the chanting became louder, animals began emerging from the forest. But these weren't normal animals. They moved in ways that seemed almost human-like. Several snakes slithered toward the fire and began moving in circular patterns around it, as if they were participating in the ritual. A family of coyotes appeared and sat watching the proceedings with an intelligence that seemed unnatural. One of my companions, a young man named Roberto, was shaking so violently that I was afraid he might have a seizure. "This is a satanic ritual," he whispered. "They're summoning demons. We have to get out of here before they sense us." We began crawling away from the cabin on our hands and knees, afraid to stand up and possibly be seen. Eduardo, despite his illness, somehow found the strength to move with us. We crawled for what felt like hours, until we were far enough away that we could no longer see the orange glow of the fire. Only then did we stand up and begin running. We ran through the forest for the rest of the night, not stopping until the sun came up and we felt safe enough to rest. None of us spoke about what we had witnessed. We were all too shaken to process it. Looking back, I still can't explain what we saw that night. Who were those people, and how did they survive in such a remote location? Where did they get the human remains they were burning? Were they responsible for the deaths of other migrants who had disappeared in those mountains? Or were they somehow connected to the drug cartels that operate in the region? The most disturbing possibility is that the torso we saw might have belonged to someone like us. Another person trying to cross the border, who had the misfortune of seeking help at that isolated cabin. The thought that we could have easily been the next victims, if we had approached them directly, still keeps me awake at night. We eventually made it across the border and got medical help for Eduardo, who recovered fully from his illness. But none of us have ever talked about what we witnessed in those mountains. Until now, I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. I've tried to research the area since then, looking for any reports of missing persons or unusual activity in that part of New Mexico, but I've found nothing. It's as if that cabin and the people who lived there exist in some kind of void, completely disconnected from the normal world. Sometimes I wonder if what we saw was even real, or if it was some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But all 5 of us saw the same thing, and the memory is too vivid, too detailed to be a shared delusion. All I know is that there are dark things happening in those remote mountains, things that most people will never see or hear about. For those of us who risk everything to cross these borders, the human dangers the border patrol, the drug cartels, the harsh environment are frightening enough. But knowing that there might be something even more sinister lurking in the wilderness makes the journey even more terrifying. I made it to safety, but I'll never forget that night, and I'll never stop wondering about the fate of other travelers who might have encountered that cabin in the mountains. Traveling has always been my passion. There's something intoxicating about stepping off a plane in a foreign country, breathing in unfamiliar air, and knowing that adventure awaits around every corner. I've been fortunate enough to visit 23 countries across 4 continents, and until 3 years ago, I'd never had anything more frightening happen to me than a delayed flight or a bout of food poisoning in Thailand. That all changed during my first trip to Paris. My college roommate, Sarah, had been living in the City of Light for nearly 6 years. She'd gone there initially for a semester abroad program and ended up staying after falling in love with both the city and a charming Frenchman named Pierre. We'd been planning a reunion for ages, but between my work schedule and her new life, we could never seem to make it happen. When I finally booked my ticket for a long weekend in March, we were both giddy with excitement. Sarah had planned an entire itinerary: the Louvre, a Seine River cruise, shopping in the Marais district, and dinner at her favorite bistro in Montmartre. It was going to be perfect. The flight from JFK was smooth, and I landed at Charles de Gaulle feeling refreshed despite the 6-hour journey. Sarah had offered to pick me up at the airport, but I was eager to start exploring immediately. I downloaded an offline map app and figured I'd take the RER train into the city, then walk through some neighborhoods to get a feel for Paris, before meeting her at her apartment in the 18th arrondissement. Looking back, I realize how naive that plan was. The train ride went smoothly enough. I managed to navigate the metro system and emerged from the Pigalle station into the afternoon sunlight, consulting my phone's GPS as I started walking north toward Sarah's address. The area was bustling with the typical mix of tourists and locals, street musicians playing accordion music, couples sharing café au lait at sidewalk bistros, and the occasional group of art students sketching the architecture. But as I walked deeper into the residential areas, following the blue dot on my map app, the touristy atmosphere began to fade. The wide boulevards gave way to narrow side streets lined with older apartment buildings. The cafes became fewer and more local-looking, their menus written entirely in French with no English translations. The people around me stopped looking like visitors and started looking like they belonged there. I should have paid more attention to my surroundings, but I was mesmerized by the authentic Parisian experience I thought I was having. The peeling paint on old doorways, the iron balconies draped with laundry, the way the afternoon light filtered through the narrow spaces between buildings. It all seemed so perfectly French, so different from the sanitized tourist areas I'd seen in guidebooks. It wasn't until I'd been walking for nearly 45 minutes that I began to feel uneasy. The streets had grown noticeably quieter, and I realized I hadn't seen another obvious tourist for several blocks. More troubling, my phone's GPS seemed to be struggling with the narrow, winding streets. The blue dot kept jumping around erratically, and I wasn't entirely sure I was still heading in the right direction. I paused at a corner to recalibrate my location and send Sarah a quick text with my updated coordinates. She responded almost immediately. "You're getting close, but that neighborhood can be tricky. Want me to come meet you at the metro station instead?" I texted back that I was fine and would be there soon, but privately I was starting to feel a bit overwhelmed. The street signs were becoming harder to read in the fading daylight, and several of the roads on my map seemed to dead end in ways that didn't match what I was seeing in person. That's when I noticed him. He was maybe 40 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket despite the mild weather. What caught my attention initially was that he seemed to be walking in the same direction I was, maintaining a consistent distance of about 30 feet behind me. When I turned left at the next intersection, he turned left too. When I slowed down to check my phone, he slowed down as well. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. This was a residential neighborhood. It made sense that someone who lived here would be walking home at the end of the workday. But as I continued towards Sarah's address, making several more turns according to my GPS, the man remained behind me, never getting closer but never falling farther back either. My heart began to race. I ducked into a small tabak shop and pretended to browse the magazines while sneaking glances out the window. The man had stopped across the street and was leaning against a building, seemingly absorbed in his own phone, but positioned where he could clearly see the shop's entrance. I bought a bottle of water I didn't need and left the store, walking more quickly now. Sure enough, when I glanced back after half a block, he was following again. I tried to remember everything I'd ever read about staying safe while traveling alone. Don't go to isolated areas. Stay where there are other people. Trust your instincts. But I was already in an isolated area. There weren't many other people around, and my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. I pulled out my phone to call Sarah, but before I could dial, I heard her voice calling my name from somewhere ahead of me. I looked up to see her running toward me from about a block away, her face twisted with panic and fear. "Run," she was shouting in English, then switching to rapid French that I couldn't understand. But I didn't need a translation to understand her tone. I spun around and saw that the man who'd been following me was now much closer, maybe 15 feet away, and walking with more purpose. Our eyes met for a split second, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. It wasn't anger or even aggression, exactly. It was a cold calculation, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be dealt with. I ran toward Sarah, my backpack bouncing against my spine with each step. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps on the pavement, but they seemed to be moving away rather than pursuing me. When I reached Sarah, she grabbed my arm and pulled me quickly around the corner onto a busier street. "Taxi," she shouted, flagging down a passing cab with the desperation of someone who'd done this before. We dove into the backseat, and Sarah rattled off her address in French to the driver. It wasn't until we were several blocks away that either of us spoke. "How did you know?" I asked, still breathing hard. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled out her own phone. "I was tracking your location on the app, and I saw you'd stopped moving for several minutes in that area. It's known for problems, especially with tourists who look lost." She glanced at me seriously. "There have been incidents, people who disappear for hours or days before turning up confused and robbed. Sometimes worse." "What kind of incidents?" "Trafficking," she said quietly. "There are groups here who target solo travelers, especially women who are obviously foreign. They have specific methods, following at a distance, waiting for you to get really lost, then approaching when you're isolated and vulnerable." I felt sick. How did I fit the profile so perfectly? American tourist, alone, expensive phone out constantly for navigation. Backpack that screams "I'm not from here." wandering into residential areas where you clearly don't belong. Sarah shook her head. You might as well have had a sign around your neck. The taxi pulled up to her building, and we hurried inside. It wasn't until we were safely in her apartment, door locked and deadbolted, that I began to process how close I'd come to becoming a statistic. Sarah made us both strong coffee and explained more about the realities of living in Paris that don't make it into the guidebooks. The human trafficking networks that prey on tourists. The areas of the city that locals know to avoid. The signals to watch for that indicate you're being targeted. The worst part, she said, is that most victims never see it coming. They think they're just having an authentic cultural experience, exploring off the beaten path, when really they've walked right into a trap. I stayed close to Sarah for the rest of my visit, sticking to well-traveled tourist areas and crowded public spaces. The Paris I saw over the next few days was beautiful and magical, everything I'd hoped it would be. But I couldn't shake the knowledge of how different my story could have ended if my friend hadn't been tracking my location, if she hadn't recognized the danger signs, if she hadn't come running through those narrow streets to find me. I still love to travel, but I'm much more cautious now. I research neighborhoods before I visit them. I share my location with trusted contacts. I pay attention to my surroundings and trust my instincts when something feels wrong. And I never, ever explore unfamiliar cities alone anymore, especially not in places where I don't speak the language and don't understand the local dangers that lie hidden beneath the surface of picture-perfect tourist destinations. My name is Julian Ortega, and I'm a field geologist with over 15 years of experience in mineral exploration. I'm sharing this story not as just another anecdote, but as testimony of something I still struggle to explain. It happened in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, in a place where time seems to have stopped among peaks and canyons. In the fall of 2023, I received an assignment from a Canadian company interested in reactivating an old silver mine abandoned since the 70s. The mine, known as Silver Creek, was located in a remote area about 3 hours by truck from the nearest town, Silverton. My task was to assess the viability of restarting operations. I arrived at base camp in an old adobe house that had once been the mine's administrative office. The place was in ruins, but still contained documents, maps, and rusted tools. I began my work reviewing blueprints and exploring the main tunnels. During the first few days, everything proceeded normally. However, on the fourth day, while inspecting a secondary gallery, I noticed something strange, recent footprints in the dust on the floor. They were clearly marked human footsteps that went deeper into a collapsed section of the tunnel. The peculiar thing was that I was the only person for miles around. Intrigued, I followed the footprints to where the tunnel had caved in. There I found a small opening through which a person could barely fit. I decided to return the next day with proper equipment to explore that section. The next day, equipped with helmet, flashlight, and ropes, I crawled through the opening. After dragging myself several meters, I reached a wide chamber that was apparently intact. What I saw left me perplexed. A kind of improvised shelter with a bed made of sacks, a table with remains of canned food, and a gas lamp that was still warm. Everything indicated that someone had been living there recently. I examined the place carefully and found a notebook with annotations in disorderly handwriting. The pages spoke of voices in the darkness, lights that shouldn't be there, and a presence that won't leave me alone. The author didn't sign his writings, but mentioned recent dates. I decided to spend the night at base camp to analyze the situation. That night, while reviewing the notes, I heard noises coming from the mine, metallic knocks, and what seemed to be a distant voice. I took my flashlight and headed toward the entrance, but found no one. The footprints I had seen the day before had disappeared. The next day, I contacted the company to inform them of my findings. They asked me to abandon the place and not mention anything to local authorities. Since then, I've investigated on my own and discovered that other geologists have had similar experiences in abandoned mines in the region. I don't know who was living in that mine or what led them there, but I'm convinced there are stories buried in those tunnels that are still waiting to be told. I decided not to leave immediately. Something inside me, a mixture of professional stubbornness and visceral curiosity, drove me to stay a few more days. I prepared my things in case I had to leave quickly, but chose to continue the exploration, this time with more caution. I returned to the secret chamber where I had found the shelter. I examined every corner meticulously. Behind some loose rocks, I found a kind of improvised hiding place, like a cache. Inside was a metal box covered with soot. In it, I found more notebooks and some old black and white photographs. They showed a group of miners in front of a tunnel entrance I didn't recognize. But what impacted me most was a loose sheet written with trembling strokes. If someone finds this, don't keep going down. There's something that shouldn't be here. It's not an animal, it's not a person. It won't let me sleep, it won't let me leave. I took it with skepticism, but at the same time couldn't deny what I had seen, the footprints, the warm lamp, the updated notebook. It wasn't an old delusion. Someone had been there days, perhaps even hours before I arrived. Obsession took hold of me. I needed to understand what was happening. I dedicated myself to tracing a map of the tunnels from the old blueprints and my own explorations. There was a section on the blueprint marked as Deep Extraction Gallery, closed since 1971, after a collapse that, according to records, left 3 dead. But the access wasn't as blocked as the documents indicated. The earth seemed recently disturbed. I spent days going deeper and deeper, guided by red chalk marks on the walls that weren't there originally. Each time I advanced, the air became denser, loaded with that mineral and humid smell found only in deep mines. I began to notice disturbing details, noises that couldn't be attributed to echo. Tools moved from place to place. The faint smell of kerosene from a lamp that wasn't mine. One night I woke up at base camp with a feeling of being watched. I checked the recordings from the camera I had left pointing toward the tunnel entrance. At 3:14 in the morning, something moved in the image. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a clearly visible person. A blurry figure wrapped in shadow stood motionless, watching toward the camera. The recording ended abruptly due to low battery. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to put an end to this. I went into the deep gallery with all my equipment, determined to reach where no one else had dared to go. I advanced for hours, marking my path with fluorescent thread, until the tunnel narrowed so much that I had to leave part of the equipment behind. Finally, I reached a wide cavity, almost natural, at the end of the gallery. There I found something I didn't expect, a kind of rudimentary altar made with old miners' helmets, rusted tools, and spent candles. In front of the altar was an old chair with a seated figure. It was a man, He wore blue overalls covered with dirt and dust. He had a long, gray beard. He didn't react when he saw me. His gaze was fixed on the wall where he had written something with charcoal. "I hear them. You hear them too, don't you?" I tried to talk to him, offered him water. He didn't react. I checked his vital signs. He was alive but completely gone, as if he had been there for years. I decided to get him out of the mine, but when I returned to look for the equipment I had left behind, everything had disappeared. The fluorescent rope, my backup flashlight, even my backpack. There were no marks, no traces of anything. It took me almost 5 hours to get back to the entrance point, carrying the unconscious man on my shoulders. I had never felt as much fear as when I was climbing through those tunnels, feeling footsteps behind me, but not daring to turn around. When I reached the exit, I collapsed. 2 days later, I woke up in a hospital in Denver. They told me that some hikers had found me halfway down the path that descends from the mountains. The man I had rescued wasn't there. There was no record of him. They hadn't seen him at the hospital or in the ambulance. Nothing. I checked my helmet camera. The last thing you see is his silhouette going down with me, and then an abrupt cut. When I returned to the mine with support days later, everything had been sealed. Someone with heavy machinery had intentionally collapsed the entrances. I never learned more about Silver Creek, but I still have the notebooks, the photos, and a handwritten note I found in the inner pocket of my jacket when I left the hospital. It said, "Thank you for getting me out. Now it's your turn to stay with them." Since then, every time I sleep, I dream of approaching footsteps. The 5 of us had been inseparable since our freshman year at Northwestern University. Even after graduation, when careers and life pulled us to different cities, we maintained our friendship through group chats, annual reunions, and a shared promise we'd made during our senior year. Whoever got married first would be treated to a dream bachelorette party funded by the other 4. That honor went to Emma, who got engaged to her longtime boyfriend, David, after a romantic proposal in Central Park. The wedding was planned for September, and as her maid of honor, I was tasked with organizing the perfect send-off for her single days. After months of planning and saving, we'd settled on Morocco specifically, a week-long trip to Marrakesh and the Atlas Mountains. It was exotic enough to feel like a real adventure, affordable enough that we could all contribute equally, and Instagram-worthy enough to satisfy Emma's need for the perfect social media documentation of her pre-wedding celebration. The 5 of us, Emma, myself, Jessica, Amanda, and Sarah, had been planning every detail for over a year. We'd researched the best riads to stay in, mapped out day trips to Berber villages, and even arranged for a traditional henna ceremony. Everything was perfectly organized, down to our matching luggage tags and coordinated outfits for each day of the trip. The flight from Chicago to Casablanca was long but smooth, and we were all buzzing with excitement as we prepared for our connecting flight to Marrakesh. We'd been traveling for nearly 14 hours, but the adrenaline of finally embarking on our long-awaited adventure kept us energized. It was during our layover at Mohammed V International Airport that things began to go wrong. Our ride to the hotel was supposed to meet us at exit gate C, which according to the airport map was accessible through a connecting corridor from our arrival terminal. The driver had texted that he'd be there in 15 minutes. So we gathered our carry-on bags and started following the signs toward the designated meeting point. The corridor was exactly what you'd expect from an international airport. Brightly lit, sterile, with that distinctive airport smell of cleaning products and recycled air. The walls were lined with advertisements in Arabic and French, and the floor was polished concrete that echoed with the sound of rolling luggage wheels. We'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when Jessica made the first comment about the corridor's length. "This is taking forever," she said, adjusting the strap of her travel purse. "How big is this airport?" Emma, who had printed out detailed maps and terminal layouts, checked her phone. "According to this, it should only be about a 10-minute walk from our gate to exit C." But 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20, and we were still walking through the same sterile corridor. The advertisements on the walls began to repeat, the same perfume ad, the same car rental promotion, the same tourism poster featuring the Atlas Mountains. "Are we going in circles?" Amanda asked, stopping to catch her breath. She was the least athletic among us and was starting to struggle with her heavy carry-on bag. I pulled out my phone to check our location, but the GPS showed only a vague blue dot somewhere inside the airport terminal with no specific details about our position. The map wasn't detailed enough to show individual corridors or walkways. "Maybe there's construction or something," Sarah suggested. "Sometimes airports reroute foot traffic when they're doing renovations." We kept walking, but now we were all paying closer attention to our surroundings. That's when we started to notice the truly strange details. The corridor appeared to be completely straight with no curves or branches. Yet we'd been walking for over 30 minutes without reaching exit C. The ceiling tiles above us were identical, the same pattern of fluorescent lights, the same air conditioning vents, the same occasional speaker for airport announcements. More unsettling was the complete absence of other travelers. In an international airport during the middle of the day, you'd expect to see dozens of people walking through the corridors at any given time. But except for us, the hallway was completely empty. Well, almost completely empty. About 40 minutes into our walk, we encountered a maintenance worker, a man in his 50s wearing a blue jumpsuit and pushing a yellow cleaning cart. He was methodically mopping the floor with slow, deliberate strokes, working his way from one wall to the other in a pattern that seemed to take forever. "Excusez-moi," Emma called out in her college French. "Où est la sortie?" The man looked up at us with tired eyes, but didn't respond. He just nodded vaguely toward the direction we'd been walking and returned to his mopping. We continued past him, but something about the encounter felt off. His movements had been almost robotic, repetitive in a way that seemed unnatural. And his cleaning cart, I could have sworn I'd seen that exact same yellow cart somewhere before, though I couldn't remember where. Another 20 minutes passed. Our excitement had long since faded into anxiety, and Amanda was starting to panic. "This is impossible," she said, her voice rising with stress. "We've been walking for over an hour. Where the hell is exit C?" "Maybe we should go back," Jessica suggested. "Find someone at an information desk who can help us." But when we turned around to look behind us, the corridor stretched endlessly in that direction too. The maintenance worker was nowhere to be seen, and the pathway looked identical to what lay ahead of us. The same fluorescent lighting, the same repetitive advertisements, the same polished concrete floor. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered. "Airports don't have corridors this long. It's physically impossible." Emma was frantically checking her phone, trying to get more specific directions or contact our driver. "I'm going to call the car service," she announced. "Maybe they can come meet us somewhere else." But when she tried to dial, her phone showed no signal at all. None of our phones had any bars, despite the fact that we'd had full connectivity just an hour earlier in the main terminal. That's when we saw him again. The maintenance worker with the yellow cart was about 50 yards ahead of us, mopping the floor in the same methodical pattern. But that was impossible. We'd passed him going in the opposite direction 20 minutes earlier. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of us, unless he'd somehow turned around and walked much faster than we had been walking. "Is that the same guy?" Amanda asked in a hushed voice. "It has to be," I replied, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure. The man looked identical, same blue jumpsuit, same yellow cart, same tired posture. But the idea that he'd somehow gotten ahead of us made no logical sense. We approached him cautiously. This time, Sarah tried speaking to him in English. "Excuse me, sir. We're looking for exit C. Can you help us?" Again, he looked up with those same tired eyes, nodded vaguely in the direction we'd been walking, and returned to his work. But as we got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The section of floor he was mopping was already perfectly clean. There were no scuff marks, no dirt, no reason for it to need cleaning at all. Yet he continued his repetitive motions, dipping the mop in the bucket, wringing it out, and swabbing the spotless concrete in slow, mechanical movements. We hurried past him without another word. "This is a nightmare," Emma said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely scared. "We're going to miss our hotel check-in. We're going to miss dinner. How long have we been walking?" I checked my phone. According to the timestamp, we'd been in the corridor for nearly 2 hours, but that seemed impossible. It felt like we'd been walking for much longer, yet somehow the time also felt compressed, like we were trapped in a moment that kept repeating itself. "Look," Jessica said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Is that an exit?" In the distance, barely visible under the fluorescent lights, we could make out what appeared to be double doors breaking the endless line of the corridor walls. We all started walking faster, then jogging, then running toward what we hoped was finally the exit. But as we got closer, the doors seemed to remain the same distance away, as if the corridor was stretching ahead of us as fast as we could move forward. We ran for what felt like 15 minutes, our luggage wheels clattering loudly on the concrete, but the doors never got any closer. "Stop," Sarah gasped, doubled over and breathing hard. "Just stop. This isn't real." We all came to a halt, standing in the middle of the corridor and trying to catch our breath. Around us, the airport was exactly the same as it had been when we'd started walking. The same lights, the same walls, the same advertisements that we'd now seen repeated hundreds of times. "What if we're dead?" Amanda whispered. "What if our plane crashed and this is some kind of purgatory?" "Don't say that," Emma snapped, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "Then how do you explain this?" Amanda gestured wildly at the endless corridor. "We've been walking for hours. We've passed the same maintenance worker multiple times. The exit keeps moving away from us. This isn't normal." I pulled out my phone again, desperate to find some rational explanation. That's when I noticed something strange about the time display. According to my phone, only 18 minutes had passed since we'd started walking toward Exit C. "Look at this," I said, showing the others my screen. "My phone says we've only been walking for 18 minutes. "That's impossible," Jessica said, checking her own phone. "We've been walking for at least 2 hours. But her phone showed the same thing, 18 minutes. So did Emma's and Sarah's and Amanda's. All of our phones, which had shown different times throughout our travels due to changing time zones, now displayed exactly the same timestamp. "Something is very wrong here," Sarah said quietly. That's when we heard it, a notification chime from Emma's phone. She looked down to see a text message from our driver. "Arrived at Exit C, where are you?" "How is that possible?" she asked. "He was supposed to meet us in 15 minutes, and according to our phones, only 18 minutes have passed." "Text him back," I urged. "Tell him we're lost." Emma typed rapidly. "We've been walking toward Exit C for hours, but can't find it. Can you come to us?" The response came immediately. "Exit C is right here. I can see the corridor entrance. Just follow the signs." "We are following the signs," Emma typed back. "I'll come look for you," came the reply. We stood there waiting, scanning the endless corridor in both directions for any sign of our driver. After what felt like another hour, but registered as only 3 more minutes on our phones, we saw a figure approaching from the direction we'd originally come. It was a man in his 30s wearing a polo shirt and jeans, carrying a small sign with Emma's name on it. But as he got closer, his expression changed from confusion to alarm. "Where have you been?" he asked in accented English. "I've been waiting at Exit C for 20 minutes. "We've been trying to reach Exit C for hours," I explained. "We can't find it anywhere." He looked at us like we were insane. "Exit C is right there," he said, pointing behind him. "It's maybe 50 meters back that way." "That's impossible," Amanda said. "We've been walking in this direction for—" But before she could finish her sentence, the driver had started walking back the way he'd come, gesturing for us to follow. Reluctantly, we trailed behind him, expecting to find ourselves walking through the same endless corridor we'd been trapped in for hours. Instead, after exactly 50 meters, we found ourselves standing in front of 2 glass doors marked Sortie C in large, clear letters. The driver pushed open the doors, and suddenly we were outside the airport terminal, breathing fresh Moroccan air and feeling warm sunlight on our faces. Cars and taxis were lined up in the pickup area, and other travelers were loading their luggage and heading off to their destinations. "Your car is right there," the driver said, pointing to a black sedan parked nearby. "Sorry for the confusion." We followed him to the car in stunned silence, tossing our bags into the trunk and climbing into the seats like people awakening from a shared dream. As we pulled away from the airport, I turned back to look at the terminal building. It was a perfectly normal, modern airport. There was nothing unusual about its architecture, nothing that would suggest the existence of an endless, impossible corridor. The exit we just walked through was clearly visible and obviously accessible, just a short walk from the main terminal area. "Did that really happen?" Jessica asked quietly as we drove toward Marrakesh. None of us answered immediately. We were all trying to process what we'd experienced, trying to find some rational explanation for the lost hours that had registered as only 21 minutes on our phones. "Maybe it was jet lag," Emma suggested weakly. "Hallucinations from being overtired." "All 5 of us having the exact same hallucination?" Sarah asked skeptically. Or maybe there was something in the air system, Amanda offered. Some kind of gas leak that affected our perception of time and space. But deep down, we all knew that none of these explanations really fit what we'd experienced. We'd been trapped in something that shouldn't have been possible. A corridor that existed outside the normal rules of physics and time. A space where distance became meaningless, and minutes could stretch into hours, while somehow remaining minutes. The rest of our trip to Morocco was wonderful. We explored the souks of Marrakesh, rode camels in the Sahara, and celebrated Emma's upcoming marriage with all the joy and excitement we'd planned for. But none of us ever talked about what happened in that corridor, as if speaking about it might somehow make it real again. Emma got married 3 months later, and the 5 of us are still close friends. But whenever we travel together now, we always stick close to each other in airports, and we never, ever take corridors that seem longer than they should be. Some experiences can't be explained, only survived. And sometimes, the most important thing is simply that you make it out the other side, back into the normal world where time moves forward and distance means what it's supposed to mean. But I still think about that maintenance worker sometimes, endlessly mopping the same clean floor in a corridor that may or may not exist, trapped in his own kind of purgatory, while travelers like us occasionally stumble into his domain and then escape back to reality. I hope he finds his own exit C someday. My name is Julian Ortega, and I'm a mountain rescue volunteer at Mount Rainier. For over a decade, I've participated in countless searches, but none like the one I'm about to tell. This experience marked me deeply, and although I've hesitated to share it, I feel it's necessary for it to be known. It all began on a Saturday in January when the cold cuts to the bone, and the peaks of Mount Rainier dress in white. We received an emergency call. A hiker identified as Diego Martinez, 27 years old, had disappeared in the Paradise area. His friends reported that after briefly separating from the group, he didn't return. We started the search at Sunday's dawn. The weather was adverse, dense fog, cutting wind, and a wind chill below 0 degrees. Equipped with GPS, radios, and provisions, we entered the forest. After hours of searching without results, I decided to explore a little-traveled path that descended toward a ravine. As I advanced, I noticed recent footprints in the snow, which gave me hope. However, following them, I encountered something unexpected, a hidden entrance among the vegetation, covered with branches and stones. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. Upon entering, I discovered a tunnel that descended in a spiral. The walls were reinforced with wood, and as I advanced, the air became denser and warmer. After a few minutes, I reached a room illuminated by gas lamps. There, to my surprise, I found Diego tied up and visibly beaten. Before I could react, I heard voices approaching. I hid behind some boxes and observed 3 armed men discussing a shipment that had to leave that night. I understood that I had discovered a clandestine operation, possibly related to human or drug trafficking. I waited for them to move away and cautiously freed Diego. He was weak but conscious. I whispered that we had to leave in silence. With great effort, we managed to return to the surface, and using my radio, I requested immediate support. Police arrived in less than an hour. Guided by our directions, they entered the tunnel and dismantled the operation. It was discovered to be a network that used Mount Rainier as a transit point for illicit activities, taking advantage of the vast extension and lack of surveillance in certain areas. Since that day, my perception of Mount Rainier changed. It's no longer just a place of natural beauty and physical challenges, but also a reminder that even in the most unexpected places, dark secrets can be hidden. I continue being a volunteer, but now with a sharper awareness of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows. After the operation, the area was cordoned off. Police arrested 6 people, all men between 30 and 50 years old with northern accents. Although authorities assured that everything was under control, I felt we had barely scratched the surface. A few days later, they called me to testify. I did it clearly, but I noticed something strange in the federal agents' attitude. They seemed more interested in knowing how I got to the tunnel than in the conditions in which we found Diego. One of them, a Commander Salgado, asked me if I had entered more than once, if I had taken photos, if I had any souvenirs. I felt interrogated not as a witness, but as someone under suspicion. Diego, for his part, was admitted to a hospital in Tacoma under custody. They said it was for his safety, but I could never speak to him again. When I asked about his condition, they told me he had been transferred to Seattle by superior orders. No one wanted to give me more details. I began to feel deep unease, as if I had opened a door that should have remained closed. 2 weeks passed. I tried to continue with my life, continue with my training, my volunteer shifts, but something didn't fit. I began to notice strange movements in the area, trucks without plates, men with binoculars at the forest's edge, helicopters flying at night. One afternoon, while checking my equipment in the rescue cabin, I found a folded paper inside my backpack. It only had one phrase written in black ink: "Stop looking." That night I couldn't sleep. I realized that the operation we dismantled wasn't the end, but just a fragment. Mount Rainier wasn't just hiding contraband, there was something more. I made a decision that to this day is hard for me to process. I went back to the tunnel site. It was no longer there. They had covered it, sealed it with concrete, and removed earth as if it had never existed. But one detail caught my attention: a series of recent footprints from large boots leading to a different trail, steeper, deeper toward the lake area. I followed that trail alone with my flashlight and a survival knife. It was midnight when I reached a cave I had never seen before. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of humidity and diesel. I advanced several meters until I reached a wider chamber. There was lithium, tools, large batteries. It was an improvised laboratory. Suddenly, a voice behind me: "You didn't know when to stop, did you?" I turned around. It was Salgado, the commander, but he wasn't alone. 4 armed men escorted him. They pointed at me, and then I understood everything. The operation, Diego's custody, the interrogation, everything had been a setup. Salgado approached and spoke to me in a low voice. "You served us well. You gave us time while you played hero, and we cleaned up the traces." I tried to run but didn't make it. They hit me on the head. I woke up hours later in a ravine near the road to Paradise Lodge with a broken forehead and dislocated arm. I had survived by miracle. I dragged myself to a road and a trucker took me to the nearest hospital. Local police took my complaint, but after I mentioned Salgado, they stopped calling me. I went to the press, to journalists, to associations. No one wanted to publish anything. Too risky, they told me. Since then, I've lived in fear. I left volunteering, sold my house in Tacoma, and moved to a town in Oregon where almost no one knows me. Mount Rainier, that place I loved so much, keeps a secret bigger than any summit, and I'm the only one who knows what really happens under its ice. But what torments me most isn't what I saw, it's what I heard. The last night while they were beating me, one of the men, laughing, said to Salgado, "And what do we do with the other one?" "He's already underground," he replied. "Not the journalist, the kid, Diego. We went too far." Then I understood. They were never going to let him leave. Diego didn't survive. They just used him, and now every time snow falls on Mount Rainier, I think of that body buried under the ice and how many more there might be down there, hidden by a network that operates with total impunity. And that may be the next time someone disappears. It won't be because they got lost, but because someone decided they should disappear. My name is Julian, and for over 20 years I worked as a forest technician in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. My job consisted of monitoring forest health, marking trees for selective logging, and ensuring that forestry practices respected community management plans. I knew those dirt roads and trails like the back of my hand. But what I experienced in the fall of 2017 changed my way of seeing this profession forever. It all began with a call from Forks, a community nestled between deep ravines and tall firs. They asked me to check an area where they had found trees marked without authorization. They supposed it was illegal loggers, something common in the region. I prepared my backpack with the basics GPS, measuring tape, notebook, water, and ventured into the forest. The first day was calm. I climbed the deer trail, passed by a dry creek, and camped near an old fire lookout tower. At dawn, I continued north, following red paint marks on the trunks. It was then that I noticed something strange. A thin rope, almost invisible, stretched between two trees at knee height. I stopped and examined it. It was a trap. If someone tripped over it, it would activate a mechanism that released a branch loaded with metal spikes. It wasn't a trap for animals. It was designed to hurt a person. I felt a knot in my stomach. I decided to document it and carefully deactivate it. I continued my path, now with more caution. About 100 meters away, I found another one, a pit covered with branches and leaves with sharpened stakes at the bottom. I took photos and marked the location on my GPS. That night I camped in an open area, away from trees that could hide more traps. I didn't light a fire and slept with one eye open. The next day I decided to return and report what I had found, but the return path was blocked. Someone had felled trees to obstruct the trail. It wasn't an accident. Someone didn't want me to leave. I took an alternate route, longer and steeper. As I advanced, I heard a crack behind me. I hid among the bushes and saw two armed men in camouflage clothing checking the trail. They weren't park rangers or military. I waited for them to move away and continued my escape, avoiding main paths. After hours of walking, I reached a forest surveillance post and alerted authorities. The investigation revealed that a criminal group was using the area for training and had installed traps to protect their territory. Since then, surveillance in the region has been intensified. I, for my part, left field work and dedicated myself to environmental education. The forest continues to be beautiful, but now I know it can also hide unimaginable dangers. Weeks passed since that incident. The local prosecutor took my testimony, and the National Guard made some patrols, but deep down I knew they wouldn't do much. That forest is vast, and its depths keep secrets that not even topographic maps can trace. The Forks community continued with their life, though rumors began to spread. Some said I had seen things I shouldn't have, others that I had made it all up to avoid returning to the woods. I tried to leave behind what I had lived through, but I couldn't. Nights filled with images I hadn't captured with the camera, hidden faces among the foliage, branches that creaked where there was no wind, and those traps so meticulously constructed, as if whoever designed them knew exactly how a human being thinks when venturing into the forest. They weren't improvised. They were rural engineering in service of harm. A month later, I received a call. It was Don Elias, the president of the Forks Community Council. His voice was low, tense. "Julian, you have to come. We found something different." I insisted I couldn't. I was no longer part of the active forestry corps. But he begged me to do it, that he only trusted me. Something in his tone made me take my backpack again. I got in the truck and took the old road toward the community. When I arrived, Don Elias and 2 young men from Forks were waiting for me, armed with rifles. They took me to a canyon known as Cougar Creek. There, among the roots of a huge Douglas fir, they had unearthed a metal box. It had no lock, just a rusty lid. Inside were notebooks dozens, covered with dried mud and mold. We opened them carefully. They were diaries written with irregular handwriting, some in pencil, others with ink smeared by humidity. They had no names, but they were confessions, stories of people trapped in the forest. Some talked about being kidnapped, others mentioned punishments, trials. One of the diaries clearly said, "Today was my 3rd day without food. They told me if I want to leave, I must catch whoever comes tomorrow. If I don't, it's my turn." We remained silent. Don Elias looked at me. What if this isn't new? What if those traps are part of something older? He took us to a cabin hidden among the rocks that they had found following a forgotten trail. The door was closed with rusted wire. Inside, everything was dust and silence, but in a corner hung a photograph. It was yellowed, half eaten away. 5 men posed in front of a campfire. One of them was my father. My heart stopped. My father had also worked as a forest technician before me. He died in an accident when I was 8 years old, or so they always told me. I recognized the place in the photo, Cougar Creek. I searched through the diaries desperately. In one dated 1994, I found a page that changed everything. July 14th. Today a new one arrived. Says his name is Ernest. He's from the state, but you can tell he knows a lot about the forest. They told him we were going to mark pines for reforestation, but when he saw the first trap, he asked too many questions. I don't know if we should let him leave. Ernest, my father's name. I left that cabin feeling the world had changed shape. All this time I believed he had died from a landslide, but now it was evident he had discovered the same thing I had. Only they didn't let him go. And then I understood why the traps were so well designed. It wasn't organized crime. It wasn't cartels marking their territory. It was a secret network of locals, of community members, of common men who had built a control system from within the forest. A kind of perverse justice, a macabre tradition where anyone could be hunter or pray, according to rules imposed in the darkness. The forest doesn't forget, they say, but some of its secrets it keeps so deeply that it makes them part of the landscape. I left that night without saying another word. I never returned to Forks, never spoke of this with anyone else until now. Because today I found an envelope without a return address under my door. Inside was a photo. Someone had followed me. In the image, I'm entering the cabin at Cougar Creek, and below, written with the same handwriting from the diaries, "It's your turn to decide, Julian. Are you going to tell this, or are you going to join us?" My name is Carlos, and I'm from El Salvador. What I'm about to tell you happened in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona in the summer of 2010, during what was supposed to be my crossing into the United States. It's an experience that changed my understanding of life, death, and the thin line that sometimes exists between them. I had owned a small electronics repair shop in San Salvador with my wife, but the gang violence was getting worse every month. They demanded protection money that we simply couldn't afford. Almost everything we earned went to these criminals just to keep our business open and our family safe. With 2 young children and no hope of improvement in our situation, I made the difficult decision to attempt the journey north. My cousin Roberto had successfully crossed 3 years earlier and was working in construction in Phoenix. He sent money when he could, but it wasn't enough to support both his new family in Arizona and ours back home. I knew the crossing would be dangerous, but staying seemed even more dangerous in the long run. I paid a smuggler nearly $3,000, our entire life savings, to guide me across the desert. Our group consisted of 12 people from various Central American countries, all of us carrying the same desperate hope for a better future. The plan was to cross through one of the most remote sections of the Sonoran Desert, where border patrol presence was lighter, but the terrain was absolutely unforgiving. The first day of walking was brutal. The August heat in the desert reaches temperatures that can kill you within hours if you're not prepared. Even in the early morning, it was over 90 degrees, and by midday, it was approaching 120. We walked mostly at night and rested during the daylight hours. But even with this schedule, the physical demands were overwhelming. On the second night, something went wrong. I began experiencing a level of exhaustion that went beyond normal fatigue. It felt like my body was shutting down. My legs became incredibly heavy, my vision started to blur, and I could barely put one foot in front of the other. I had been in good physical condition before starting the journey, so this sudden weakness was alarming. The guide kept pushing us forward, repeatedly warning that anyone who couldn't keep up would be left behind. "The desert doesn't wait for anyone," he said. "If you fall behind, you die alone out here." But despite his threats, my body was giving out. I simply couldn't continue at the pace the group was maintaining. During a brief rest stop, I told the guide I needed a few more minutes to recover. He looked at me with contempt and said, "5 minutes. After that, we're moving with or without you." I sat on a rock, trying to summon the strength to continue, but when I looked up, the group was already moving away. I called out to them, but they kept walking. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the darkness. I was alone in the vast Sonoran Desert with less than half a bottle of water and a single energy bar. The nearest town was at least 30 miles away, and I had no idea which direction to go. The panic was overwhelming. I sat there in the sand and cried like a child, thinking about my wife and children, knowing I might never see them again. I spent the entire next day walking in what I hoped was the right direction. But the desert landscape all looks the same: endless stretches of sand, cacti, and rock formations. By evening, I had finished my water and my energy bar. I was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and completely lost. As the sun set and the temperature began to drop, I accepted that I was probably going to die in that desolate place. I lay down on the sand, looking up at the stars, and tried to make peace with my fate. I thought about my children and how they would grow up without their father. I thought about my wife, who would have to face the gangs alone. The guilt was almost worse than the physical suffering. It was sometime after midnight when I heard footsteps approaching. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Dehydration can cause all kinds of mental symptoms. But the sound was too clear, too rhythmic to be imaginary. I managed to sit up and saw a figure walking toward me across the desert. It was a young man, probably in his early 20s, wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt. What struck me immediately was how clean he looked. His clothes weren't dusty or torn, and he didn't appear to be suffering from heat or exhaustion. In that environment, after what I had been through, his appearance seemed almost impossible. When he reached me, I tried to speak, to ask for help, but my throat was so dry I could barely make a sound. He looked down at me with an expression of profound sadness, as if he understood exactly what I was going through. Without saying a word, he gestured for me to follow him. I struggled to my feet and gathered my backpack. The young man began walking, and I followed as best I could. He moved at a pace that was somehow perfectly matched to my limited abilities, not so fast that I couldn't keep up, but steady enough that we were making progress. Throughout our journey together, he never spoke to me, not once. I tried several times to start a conversation, asking him where we were going, how he had found me, whether he had water I could share. But he never responded. He just kept walking, occasionally looking back to make sure I was still following. His silence was eerie, but I was so grateful for his guidance that I didn't question it too much. We walked for what felt like hours through the desert night. I have no idea how long we actually traveled, because I was in and out of consciousness, sometimes walking in a kind of delusional state where I wasn't entirely sure what was real and what wasn't. But the young man was always there, a few steps ahead of me, leading me forward. Just as dawn was beginning to break, I saw lights in the distance. Vehicle lights. As we got closer, I could see it was a border patrol truck parked near what looked like a dirt road. 2 agents were standing beside their vehicle, and when they saw me approaching, they immediately ran toward me. I collapsed before they reached me. I was severely dehydrated and hadn't eaten in over 2 days. The agents caught me as I fell and began administering first aid immediately. They gave me water, called for medical assistance, and loaded me into their truck. As they were helping me into the vehicle, I kept looking around for the young man who had guided me to safety. I wanted to thank him, to make sure the agents helped him too. But when I asked them about him, they looked at me with confusion. "What young man?" one of them asked. "You were walking alone when we spotted you. There's nobody else out here." I insisted that someone had been with me, that a young man had led me to them. I was becoming agitated, worried that they weren't going to help my guide. but both agents assured me that they had been watching me through binoculars for several minutes as I approached, and I had been completely alone the entire time. "Sir, there are no footprints out there except yours," one of them said gently. "You've been walking by yourself." They treated me for dehydration and eventually deported me back to Mexico, from where I flew home to El Salvador. The physical recovery was relatively quick, but the mental impact of what happened in that desert has stayed with me for years. Who was the young man who guided me to safety? How could he have appeared so clean and healthy in that brutal environment? Why didn't he speak to me? And where did he go when the Border Patrol agents found me? The most logical explanation is that I was hallucinating due to severe dehydration and exhaustion. But the experience felt completely real. I can still remember exactly what he looked like, how he moved, the expression of sadness on his face. If it was a hallucination, it was incredibly detailed and consistent. But there's another possibility that I've considered, especially given how many people have died in that desert over the years. Maybe the young man was someone who had attempted the same crossing I was making, someone who hadn't been as fortunate as I was. Maybe his spirit remains in that desert, helping other lost souls find their way to safety. I've tried to research disappearances in that area, looking for reports of young men who might have died attempting border crossings. There are so many missing person cases, so many families who never learned what happened to their loved ones, that it's impossible to identify who my guide might have been. What I do know is that I survived an experience that should have killed me, and I didn't survive it alone. Someone or something helped me reach safety when I had given up all hope. Whether it was an angel, a spirit, or simply a kind stranger who chose to remain anonymous, I will be grateful for the rest of my life. I never did make it to the United States. I returned to El Salvador, and fortunately, the security situation there has improved significantly over the past few years. My family is safe, my business is doing well, and I no longer feel the need to risk everything for an uncertain future in another country. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about that mysterious young man in the desert, and I wonder if he's still out there, helping other desperate people find their way home. My name is David, and I was born in rural Montana. From a young age, I helped my parents with the small ranch we owned, and after I graduated high school, I took over working the land with my father. I learned quite a bit, and we were doing relatively well, but when my mother was diagnosed with lung cancer, we had to sell the ranch to pay for her treatment. We moved in with my Uncle Pete, who had left for another country many years ago. He was the one who convinced me to come work with him. One day, while we were talking on the phone, he assured me that in Australia, where he lived, you could make good money with ranch work. He asked if I knew how to handle all-terrain vehicles, trucks, motorcycles, and all that. I told him yes, and he said he would help me get to Australia. He paid for my ticket and got the company he worked for to sponsor me, so they gave me a work visa. And in less than a month, I was on a plane bound for the city of Brisbane, on Australia's east coast. The company we worked for had tons of workers on their payroll, and the business was simple. If any farm needed help, they contacted the company and sent several of us depending on what was needed. If it was herding cattle, we herded cattle. If it was cutting firewood, we cut firewood. Whatever needed to be done got done. What is true is that at first it was a bit difficult for me to adapt because I didn't know much English. And besides, Australians have a really weird accent, but I got used to it pretty quickly. What they have weird in their accent, they make up for in being good people. Plus, the pay was good, and by the second month I was already sending enough money to my parents. Now, I doubt anyone doesn't know this, but Australia has a reputation for having quite diverse and strange fauna, not to mention dangerous. Well, I assure you they've earned that reputation well. Working on a ranch in the Queensland region, I got to see venomous snakes, scorpions the size of my hand, crocodiles, kangaroos, lizards as long as my arm. Even the cattle were dangerous because they're semi-wild. They graze freely across those gigantic lands with hardly any intervention from the owners, so when we had to work with the cattle, we'd mount all-terrain vehicles and had to fight with them to herd them. Well, it was during one of those jobs, herding cattle, that I lived through one of the worst experiences of my life. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you I'm sure we could have died. Back then, I became friends with a guy they nicknamed Wolfie. It was ironic, because he was actually quite gentle and quiet, nothing like a wolf. He was from Germany originally, and his real name was Wolfgang, but everyone just called him Wolf or Wolfie. He was quite kind and calm but didn't talk much. One afternoon, after we and 12 other workers had arrived with a group of 400 head of cattle, they did the count, and about 7 were missing. We had to go back and look for them, and despite our representative trying to convince the ranch owner to wait until morning, he insisted we go out right then, because they could wander even further away. He was a stubborn and stupid old man, but he was the one paying, so we got in the trucks, turned the headlights on full blast, and split up across that old man's ranch. Now, finding 7 cows at nightfall on an Australian ranch was nearly impossible. Australia is a giant country, enormous, and the ranches usually have acres and acres of almost virgin land, full of trees and infinite plains with 2 colors, green and brown. And surprise, most of the cows are brown. Wolfie and I were advancing along a dirt road looking in all directions. I had been driving all day, so my back hurt. Wolfie took the wheel and I went with my arm outside the truck, lighting up the field with a pretty powerful flashlight, but nothing could be seen. Most interesting thing was a couple of kangaroos that got scared by the noise of the truck. We kept advancing until we reached a river that crossed the ranch. I remember we followed the river for a while, not only looking for a bridge, but also lighting up the water, in case one of the cows was drinking or being devoured by a crocodile. Suddenly, I heard movement on the other shore. I shined the light as quickly as I could and noticed how something hid in the tall grass and ran toward the plain. Cows usually fled from us, so I didn't rule out that it was one of them. After 2 minutes, we reached a wooden bridge, crossed it, and drove to the area where I thought the cow was. We found nothing. I lit up the ground to see if it had left tracks, and suddenly I felt a stab in my stomach when I saw some strange dog tracks, very large, with enormous claws. I'll never forget the conversation I had with Wolfie. "Are there wolves here?" "No, but there are dingoes. They're like dogs, but wild." "Why, did you see one?" "No, wait, slow down. How big are dingoes? Are they very large?" I remember he shrugged before telling me. "I don't know, they're like normal dogs, maybe a little bigger." "Why? What's wrong with you?" I was trying to understand what the hell I had seen then, so I asked him to back up. Without getting out of the all-terrain vehicle, we saw the tracks. They were enormous, 5 times those of a dog. I don't even know what to compare them to. Maybe a polar bear's tracks. Unfortunately, when this story happened, phones with cameras weren't common yet. In fact, the only way we had to communicate with the others was with some enormous satellite phones. We got pretty scared because we didn't know there was such a large animal in Australia. And again, I heard sounds in the tall grass that frightened me. I told Wolfie we better get out of there, and he didn't think twice. He hit the accelerator, and we continued down the road. We had nothing in the car to entertain us. As I said, Wolfie was very calm and quiet, and there was no radio signal in that area, so we couldn't listen to music. We could only hear the whistle of the wind and the natural sounds of the Queensland plain at night. That calm saved our lives. Suddenly, Wolfie and I heard panting. I know it was at the same time because we both turned to look at each other at the same time, as if we expected that sound to be some kind of joke. Plus, a coppery smell reached my nose, and I was just about to comment something to my companion when suddenly I felt an acceleration and saw Wolfie pressing the pedal hard. I looked in the rearview mirror, and a giant animal was following the truck. I turned around in my seat and lit it up with the flashlight. It had huge yellow eyes and large ears. It looked like a wolf, but with very short fur, orange-colored with fibrous muscles. It was a thing over 6 feet tall running behind us, growling and panting while trying to catch up to us. Its mouth was full of yellow teeth and black gums, drooling disgusting foam. I was yelling at Wolfie not to brake, that it was following us. We had it practically on top of us. You could tell it had been stalking us and got very close before we saw it. I didn't realize we were already going 50 miles per hour. How could that damn animal keep up with us? At one point, I thought about calling on the phone. I grabbed the satellite phone we had in the back seat, but I was too scared to dial, and the truck was bouncing too much. The phone kept falling from my hands, or I would dial the wrong number. It must have chased us for 5 minutes, and I don't know how Wolfie prevented the truck from flipping over or getting stuck in one of the road's potholes. But God bless his nerves of steel. The beast seemed tireless, and at some point, the only hope of losing it seemed to be returning to the ranch buildings. We reached a bridge a couple of miles up, and as soon as we crossed it, the beast simply stopped. I lit it up again as we drove away, and I'm not ashamed to admit I almost wet myself. It happened that, at that moment, when I looked into its eyes, I understood that that animal was not natural. Not only because it managed to chase us for 5 minutes, but because in its gaze I saw something that doesn't exist in any predator: hatred. I think I need to explain. When a lion or a pack of wolves loses prey, they can feel frustration or sadness, but hatred is not something that should cross their minds. Tiger doesn't hate a wild boar for escaping, but in that creature's eyes I felt deep resentment as it watched our all-terrain vehicle drive away, and I observed its bright yellow eyes disappear into the darkness. Wolfie and I hardly said anything, and he only stopped when we reached the ranch. Our companions had found 5 of the 7 remaining cows. When they saw us so anxious, they asked what was wrong. We answered that nothing, but it was obvious we were lying, so we told them the truth. They didn't seem surprised, although I think it was because they simply thought we were exaggerating. To them, we were just a couple of foreigners getting scared by the local fauna. The rest of the night, the Australian natives told us that in the interior, there are many animals that no one knows anything about, but that didn't console me. And I know it didn't console Wolfie either, because no animal could ever do any of what we saw. Years have passed, and I ended up saving money to bring my parents over. Now we live in a city in southern Australia. I got married and I'm still working for the same company, but in offices. I'm doing well, but sometimes I remember what I saw, and I can't help but think, what would have happened if that damn all-terrain vehicle had broken down, or if Wolfie had braked for a second? I'm sure I wouldn't be telling this story. By the way, the 2 remaining cows appeared dead 18 miles into the ranch's interior. They said they were hunted by 2 packs of dingoes, but I'm not so sure. What haunts me most about that night isn't just the creature itself, but the intelligence I saw in its actions. The way it had been tracking us, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The calculated patience of a predator that understood strategy in ways no ordinary animal should. In the months that followed, I heard whispers from other ranch hands about similar encounters. Stories passed down through generations of Australian families, tales of creatures that roamed the vast interior, things that defied classification. The Aboriginal workers would sometimes mention the old spirits with a reverence that made my skin crawl. I never saw it again, but sometimes, during those long nights in the Australian outback, I would catch a whiff of that same coppery smell on the wind, and I would remember those yellow eyes filled with an intelligence and hatred that no earthly creature should possess. Official reports always blamed dingo attacks, but those of us who worked the deep country knew better. Australia's interior holds secrets that science hasn't catalogued, creatures that exist in the spaces between known and unknown, in the vast emptiness where civilization fears to tread. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.